One of my earliest memories are from a funeral. At the time, I didn't understand that it was a funeral. It's a confusing thought. I wasn't scared or sad. It was just a lot of people that I knew gathered in one room. A lot of them were upset, that much I remember. But there was something else. There was a man in the room resting on a big table. There was an older woman in a robe talking to us in a soft tone. At some point, my mother picked me up and we walked to the man on the table. He was being wrapped in plastic. I cried and my mother rocked me in her arms. I didn't understand that the man was dead, but how could I? I had never seen anybody die. A couple of the older kids were given blow dryers to help shrink the plastic. My mother put me down while she helped turn the body to get the wrapping right. I retreated to the end of the table, where I played with my favorite Ninja Turtle toy. When no one was looking, I pricked a hole in the plastic, just between the man's toes. It was an accident. I was playing and the toy had a sharp edge. I was a bit embarrassed, and so I didn't say anything. We all sat there for hours, singing songs and talking in hushed voices. The old woman in the robe was so kind and careful. I remembered her stroking my hair and kissing me on the cheek. All the children of the town were there, both the infants and the teenagers. And they didn't want us to sleep, but we couldn't help it. They gave us candy to keep us motivated, but I still nodded off. I was barely awake when I heard the noise. I remember the plastic turning this thick, ink-like black, and then something slipped out right there, in that hole that I had poked between his toes. Something moved. I remember drawing in a cold breath that made me choke. It was so cold that I could feel something crystallizing down my throat. My voice burned and my heart kept beating louder and louder. I didn't understand what was happening. The last thing I remember from that day was the kind old woman screaming at two men to hold me down, as she hurried to me with a bone saw and an apologetic expression. Next thing I remember, I was in the hospital. It wasn't that bad. Getting fed through a tube in your arm is weird, but I got so many toys and comics from that day that it felt like Christmas all over. I had aches and pains, but they passed. Once I was okay, my parents sent me to live with my aunt in a neighboring town. I didn't like it, but they painted it as a great opportunity and a chance to meet new friends. They said that it was temporary, and I believed them. I hadn't met enough liars to know the signs. That temporary solution lasted all through my childhood. My aunt is a wonderful woman, and how she managed to care for not only me but my two cousins is beyond me. My parents would send her money, but they would never come to visit. We never talked about them. And when they passed in the winter of 2016, I wasn't told until long after their funeral. I can't say that I miss them. I wish I could, but I can't. After high school, I decided to pursue a degree in anthropology. I don't want to attribute all my interest to that first memory, but I can't say that it didn't have an impact on me. I had no idea why our burial ritual had been so strange compared to anything that I've read. We bury our dead in coffins in the ground or we cremate them. We don't shrink wrap them in front of an audience. For the longest time, I thought it was something that I made up. A bad dream brought on by a nasty fever. But the more I thought about it, the more that I had to know for sure. While studying for my master's degree, I decided that I was going to write a paper about this custom. That is, if it was real to begin with. I had a couple other topics lined up just in case. I asked my aunt about it. She wasn't too happy talking about the topic, as it brought up bad memories of my parents. She asked me to consider other ideas. However, I took note of something interesting. She never disputed the fact that the shrink wrapping was real. She would mention how that town wasn't a big deal, and how it wasn't noteworthy. But she never said that I was wrong. That village is in rural South Dakota. If you follow the Runalong River past the town of Hilltop and the wheat farms and far enough to the northwest, there's a hillside community with about 550 people. And not a lot of folks choose to settle there, as the place has spotty wireless and the roads have barely been maintained since the 70s. You'd be excused for not knowing that it existed. Most people just notice their Wi-Fi going bad as they drive past. Those who live up there are mostly retirees, but there's a couple who make their living doing seasonal jobs for these surrounding farms and ranchers. There's a grocery shop and a couple of truck drivers, and a church. If you follow the main road, you get to a bus stop. There's a preschool, but not a lot of children. Despite my aunt's disinterest, I decided to pursue this topic. I called up the village priest. The one that I remembered was already an old woman, so I figured there would be somebody else attending the flock. Turns out I was right. I got in touch with a man named Pastor Oswald. He picked up before the second dial tone. I was sitting in my car at the time, holding my phone with my cheek as I scribbled in my notebook. Pastor Oswald, I asked. Hope I got the right number. Oh, sorry, I don't get a lot of calls, he laughed. Who am I speaking to? I introduced myself as a master's student in anthropology and explained my interest in their burial rites. I didn't bring up the details of my past, thinking this person probably didn't know about me either way. I explained how I was there to interview and observe for academic purposes. Pastor Oswald waved it off. Oh, no problem at all, he assured me. We have a ceremony scheduled 2 days from now that you're welcome to attend. Respectfully, of course. How could I say no? I drove out there on the day of the ceremony. I was told that it would be held later in the evening, so I had plenty of time to make myself reacquainted with the town. I took a detour off the highway and noticed that my internet connection was going spotty, so I knew that it wasn't far. There was something familiar about the smell. It's strange how well something that small sticks with us. Just from taking a deep breath, I could tell that I had been there before. Springtime never really changes. It was just that time of year when it's still uncomfortably cold, but the sun shines so brightly that it stings your eyes. Wear a warm jacket is too much, but leaving it at home is too little. That in-between space where nature stays by the door like a cat, meowing at you to open, but not knowing if it wants to leave. I found the bus stop and subsequently the road leading into town. I don't think that I've ever seen a more beaten up patch of asphalt. There had to be some other way for trucks to get up there that I didn't know about. I could hear my insurance premiums cry as these shock absorbers struggled to keep pace. The town church was a classic white with a small turn-of-the-century Midwestern bell tower. I couldn't see the bell though. There were a couple of cars parked outside, but nobody seemed to be around. I knocked a couple of times on the big double doors, but nobody answered. I figured that I would give Pastor Oswald a call, but I couldn't get a signal. It was the middle of the day, but there were a couple of people milling about, mostly older folks walking their dogs or buying groceries. Out of all the people that passed by, 3 of them were under the age of 60, and they might just to have appeared younger than what they really were. The grocery store had a bit of a cafe corner where you could sit down to have a sandwich. It wasn't so much a coffee place as it was a collection of chairs scattered around a handful of wobbly tables, with a couple of handwritten signs showing the price of drinks. It looked way too cheap, but that's probably because they hadn't adjusted for the past 6 years of inflation. I grabbed a seat by the window, looking out over an abandoned street. A couple of crows had made their way into a trash can and threw garbage out like there was no tomorrow. They looked like they knew what they were doing. More young birds than there were young people. As I sat down for lunch, a peculiar man walked in. He was in his early 50s with a shaved head and a 5 o'clock shadow lining his jaw. Bit of a beer belly, but he had these really clear green eyes. He gave me a long look, stopped and circled back. He pointed a finger at me and cocked his head. "I know you," he stated. "How do I know you?" "I don't think you know me," I said. "Sorry." "Now hold on." He sat down across from me, still thinking out loud, and then pointing again, he started listing names. My mother, my father, my aunt, a couple of my cousins, and then something clicked. He snapped his fingers. "Oh, don't tell me," he said. "You're Henry's kid." "You got me there," I admitted. "You see the family resemblance." "Don't you?" I raised an eyebrow at that. He looked at me like I was an idiot. "Jerry, Uncle Jerry, Dad's brother." "I'd never heard of an Uncle Jerry." Figures." He reached out a hand. I was hesitant at first, but he had a genuine smile. That, and he had managed to list a whole bunch of names from my family, some of which I barely remembered myself. He was the real deal in one way or another. I shook his hand as he started firing off a bunch of questions. We had a lot of catching up to do. We spoke for hours. He was pleasant to talk to, and the more that I looked, the more of myself I could see in him. We had the same ears, for example, and the same space between our front teeth. I told him about my studies and the peculiar memory of the shrink wrapping, and he perked up at that. "Oh, they still do it," he said. "It's the strangest thing." "You know what it's about?" "Yeah, I'm surprised you don't. Given the circumstance, you know." "What are you talking about?" I sipped my coffee as he gave me a curious look. He crossed his arms and leaned back in his seat. They call it Good Friday lung. You had it as a kid. Don't you remember?" Good Friday lung was a condition brought on by something in the soil. They didn't have an explanation for it, but it was something that occurred at about 3 to 5 days of decomposition. A person who died would exude this black smoke that made people sick. Apparently that's something that I got when I was younger. That would explain my memory. How burying them just makes it spread through the soil. Gets sucked up into the groundwater and the crops. It's dangerous stuff. What about cremation? Burning them spreads it faster. Gets in the air like a cloud. A whole bunch of people died from that at the turn of the century, according to the church records. What about acid, liquidation? That might work, but that'd be expensive as hell. You can't just get industrial-grade body-burning acids at a moment's notice. So yeah, we shrink wrap. Simple. I gotta see it for myself. Well, you'll get to. Old Harlan passed a couple days ago. Sad to see the stuttering old fool go, but Jerry shrugged. That's life. I had never heard of Good Friday lung. It sounded ridiculous. Apparently it was some kind of aerial infection that affected people who had lived in that town too long. They tried several techniques over the years, but shrink wrapping was the simplest and most cost-effective way to prevent any harm from spreading. It didn't quite explain everything. For example, why did they gather all the children at the ceremony? It seemed ill-advised to bring all the young to witness something so macabre. What Jerry had shared was a start, but it didn't quite paint the full picture. I had never heard of anything like this, and yet they all accepted it like it was a part of everyday life. My estranged uncle was supportive of my research into the subject, albeit a little bit less helpful than he might have wanted to be. For example, he had no idea where the condition had originated, Apparently, it was just a part of living by the river. Later that evening, people gathered at the church, and Jerry was supposed to meet up with me a little bit later, so this was my chance to talk to Pastor Oswald and get a bit of history. The double doors were wide open, and a group of 24 people had already gathered. And there on the stone altar at the very front was an old, dead man, as naked as the day that he was born. Pastor Oswald spotted me across the room. Compared to most people living there, he was relatively young, only 40 or so years old. He had these big glasses and an aw shucks kind of demeanor to him. I could easily see him as someone willing to geek out at some kind of convention. He shook my hand and invited me in. "Oh, glad to see a new face. These are trying times, but it's important to challenge perspectives. I hope that I'm not interrupting. Oh, just don't touch anything, you'll be fine." He showed me around the room and introduced me. There were 2 men by the back that were supposed to transport the body after the ceremony, locking it in a crypt. There were a couple of volunteers helping with the plastic wrapping and turning the body. And then there were the children. As part of the ceremony, about a dozen children were there to help out. Most of them were given blow dryers to help the plastic shrink into this vacuum-tight seal. I had a couple of questions about that. "Is there a particular reason why you're involving the children?" I asked. "No, they're most susceptible to the condition," he explained. "If somebody gets sick, we need to know right away. That's why it's best to keep everybody around until we know the seal will hold. Involving them in the ceremony keeps them close and occupied." "Then why not keep them in the back or the other room?" "Well, then we can't immediately see if they get affected. They also get impatient from the waiting." "Then why are there no paramedics around or doctors? Maybe gas masks or..." "It's not that kind of condition." While Pastor Oswald still smiled, I can tell there was something in my line of questioning that poked a nerve. I slowed down, brought out my notebook, and took it one question at a time. "Well, then what kind of condition is it?" Pastor Oswald mulled the question over as he double-checked his equipment. There was a veil that was supposed to go over the body once the ceremony was complete. There was a wheeled gurney to roll the body out, to be sealed in a communal crypt. Those things I expected. What bothered me was the table with instruments and songs, flutes and tambourines, child-sized. "We've had a lot of people trying to fix it over the years," he explained. "They can't find a source. They can't even tell if you have it or not. It's not until the moment you lay dead and the decay sets in that the condition reveals itself. And by then you want them contained." "Exactly," he nodded. "But as far as prevention goes or the source of the contamination, your guess is as good as mine. I just know that it's been here a long time and it'll probably be here long after you and I are gone." "Then why not just move?" "Well, if you have it, you'll just be bringing it somewhere else. A lot of folks don't want to take that chance, so they've decided to stick around. But as you might have noticed, there's a lot less people living here than there used to be. So in a generation or two, who knows?" He handed me a small bowl full of wrapped chocolate mints. I took one and smiled as he hurried off to help an older man with a walker. The ceremony started at about 9 p.m. Most people sat down in the pews, but the children were sat up front by the altar. Pastor Oswald spoke in a very calm and reassuring tone. He explained it as a blessing, a challenge of faith to be overcome. "In these trying modern times, we often forget about the imperceptible things that shape our lives. Things like the way the wind carries our breath, how the moon shines through our window when the power goes out, how faith lifts us out of bed to carry our burdens. But men like Harland know of these things, and they know them well." It was a beautiful speech, and I remembered to take notes, but I was a bit distracted. I didn't even notice Uncle Jerry sneaking in to sit at my side. I was about to say something to him when he raised a finger to his lips, showing me that I ought to stay quiet. Pastor Oswald painted this ceremony as a reassurance of faith, that we're willing to do what we must in order to retain the natural order of things, that we must not let Harlan be remembered as something harmful to the community. The ceremony was explained as tying a final ribbon on a life well lived. And there were a lot of songs and hymns, some which I had heard before and some not. And Jerry seemed to know all of them by heart. Some kids helped out by playing simple instruments or tapping their feet. And there was an older woman playing the church organ. Pastor Oswald had a surprisingly strong voice. Harlan's widow described her husband's love for the outdoors and how he loved to take moonlight walks by the wheat fields. She urged everyone to take the scenic route home that night, as it was a full moon, to maybe get a sense of what he appreciated so much about the open sky. It was a nice thought, and I could see more than a few tears among the audience. Her jab about his chain smoking got a couple of laughs too. As the ceremony neared midnight, the children were asked to come up to the plastic-wrapped body with their blow dryers. As the machines began to whir, I could hear the plastic creak as the wrap tightened. It didn't take long. All of a sudden, the man on the altar had gone from a person to a package, anonymous and generic. As the songs continued, I noticed a shift in the room. The plastic was slowly turning gray, and the two men who were charged with moving the body were on high alert, but not towards the body. They were looking at the congregation, the children in particular. The parents were too. It's like no one was really watching the dead body in the room. Something was changing. As the plastic turned completely black, everyone seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The plastic seal seemed to hold. Pastor Oswald cheered, and the congregation cheered with him as they celebrated and gave thanks. The body was carefully moved to the wheeled gurney and covered in a thin veil. The two men wheeled the body out, and I got up to follow them. Pastor Oswald stopped me with a hand on my shoulder. "I'm sorry, but you can't come with them. It's a safety measure. Not even from a distance." He rolled his eyes a little and looked around the room. One of the kids was pulling on his sleeve, demanding his attention. "All right, from a distance," he agreed. "Just don't touch anything, you understand?" "I'll keep my distance." He mouthed a silent thank you as he diverted his attention to a young boy wanting to show off his tambourine skills. Most of the children were being taken home. The ritual was over. I followed the two men outside. There were no graves, only mausoleums. The men stopped as they realized that I was following, but I assured them that I would keep my distance. They nodded at that and continued rolling the body down the path. The wheels on the gurney struggled against the gravel. They were in the middle of a casual conversation not really related to anything. Perhaps this was a bit of a routine for them. Given the average age of those who lived there, that wouldn't surprise me. They were discussing one of them buying a new car from a less than reputable dealer, and the pros and cons of such an investment. Halfway down the line of mausoleums, they stopped. Turns out that they had messed up the number and taken a wrong turn. They had to backtrack and go around. It was a bit of a hassle, so before they did, they decided to go on a smoke break. As promised, I kept my distance as they left the body on the table. There was no wind and the gurney was steady, so there was no harm in it. I joined them in their discussion, trying not to impose. I asked a couple of practical questions about the ceremony and the history of their role. I made a couple of notes about how they were called ferrymen before they returned to their topic of second-hand cars. As they did, my ears perked up. I was hearing something, but I couldn't put my finger on what. I looked around for Jerry, but he was still inside with the others. It was something else. Not a breeze rustling the leaves, not a single drop of rain. No smell coming from the dry old blue sunflowers resting by the mausoleum door. No, it was something much more mundane. A crow. The ferryman hadn't noticed it. It had landed on the edge of the gurney thinking the plastic wrap held some kind of trash-like delicacy. These birds were hard-coded to tear through a wrapping to find the goodies inside, and it didn't take long to act on those impulses. By the time that the ferryman noticed it was too late, the crow poked its beak straight through the plastic as a black gas seeped out. It's hard to explain exactly what it looked like. It was a gas, but it moved like a liquid. But that's just the thing. It moved. Not just poured out, it moved with purpose. It swayed from side to side before dissolving into the ground. The ferryman freaked out as a confused crow took flight. Dang it, he got out. One of them sprinted for the church. The other hurried up to the gurney and brought out 3 sets of straps from underneath. He positioned them over the legs, chest, and head of the body in a trained routine. Seconds later, the body moved. It wasn't a conscious movement as much as a spasm. Some dying mechanism triggering at full power, causing the whole body to flex. If he hadn't tightened the straps, more of the plastic would have ripped. There was still some black inside. Using duct tape, he secured the hole the crow had poked. "Get inside," he screamed. "Get inside now." It was full panic inside the church. The children who hadn't left yet were being held to the floor by their parents. The other ferryman was sprinting to his car to get the others. Pastor Oswald held a walkie-talkie in his left hand and a bone saw in his right. I walked up to him, watching his demeanor change from calm and collected to borderline frantic. "What is the bone saw for?" I asked. He looked up at me, but he didn't answer. He kept his eyes trained on the children. "What is the bone saw for?" I repeated. He swallowed hard, regaining his composure. "His safety measures." Pastor Oswald got regular updates through his walkie-talkie. They were going house by house, checking out the children in town. What exactly they were checking for wasn't apparent. They were doing a sort of head count, listing off the family names of those cleared. The kids who were held down were being let up as suspicions faded. Things seemed to be okay for now. "Go check the wheat fields," Pastor Oswald demanded. Harlan liked the wheat fields. I noted it in my book and I looked for Uncle Jerry. He was off in the corner staying well out of everyone's way. I hurried up to him. I barely got the question out of my mouth before he answered it. "It's not just a lung disease. It's unnatural, defiant." "I don't understand." "Some things don't work as they're supposed to. One explanation fails to account for impossible things. Sometimes we just have to make do with what works." "Well, then explain it. Explain what you think happens." He looked at me and then back at the congregation. The tension was starting to subside. "Old Harlan didn't want to go yet, so he clawed his way back for one more go. He just needs to find someone willing to carry on for him. Like a possession." And Jerry looked around the room and gave me the tiniest nod. As the congregation's tolerance to outsiders waned, Pastor Oswald hurriedly asked me to leave. He wasn't harsh about it, but rather matter-of-factly. This was a time of crisis in his community and he couldn't take the time to be a good host. He insisted that I come back in a couple of days when things calmed down, and he'd be happy to explain exactly what happened. But for now, I had to leave. I got in my car, waved goodbye to Uncle Jerry, and I slowly made my way out of town. Not exactly the way I'd expected the day to go, but I wasn't about to intrude. Not on a night like this. I carefully bumped my way down the crappy road leading out of town and took a left. My car kept complaining about the Wi-Fi connection. I followed the road, curling back and forth. There were no streetlights, but the moon was as large as ever. That, and I wasn't really expecting to see a lot of people on these roads. That is, until I noticed something up ahead. There was a car in the middle of the road. The motor was still running. I could see the exhaust. The driver's side door was wide open and covered in blood. I stayed in my car, trying to get a signal on my phone. It didn't work. I shuffled my way out the door. I had to check if someone was injured. I mean, it sure looked like somebody was injured, but there was no damage to the car. They hadn't hit anything. There was just a lot of open doors and blood, especially in the driver's seat. I called out to see if anyone was there, but nobody responded. The keys were still in the ignition. There was a comic book in the back seat. It was torn in half. I turned back towards my car and stopped. There was someone standing next to it, looking in through the window. The silhouette was barely covered by the moonlight, showing a figure with one arm much bigger than the other, a tilted torso shaped like a lowercase b. I could see the gleam of white in their eyes, but there was too much of it. Too many. It turned to me, still holding something in its left hand. It left a bloody handprint on my car. It tried to speak, but all that came out was a painful, drawn-out wailing. It was fast, much faster than me for sure. The moment it started running, I was only about 6 steps ahead. I threw myself into the parked car and I slammed the driver's side door shut. I crawled over to the passenger side as the door was torn straight off and thrown down the road. I crawled out the other side and shut the passenger door behind me, trapping whatever was coming for me in the car. At least for a couple of seconds. It didn't take long for it to break through. I couldn't just run down the road in a straight line, it would catch me. I had to try and lose it. There was a wheat field on the left side of the road and I figured I could lose it in there. I ran straight into it, keeping my head down and slowing only to hide my sound. I could hear something following me, something frustrated, with a deep, wheezing breath, like a man slowly choking to death. I managed to find a spot in the middle of the field where I could duck down. It was right by the edge in the shade of a tree. There was no way that thing would accidentally find me there. I listened to it shuffling about. It was nowhere near me, but I could tell that there was something wrong with it. The proportions were wrong, the sounds were wrong. It tried to speak, but it turned into either screams or a strangely coherent stutter. It sounded like words, but I couldn't make them out. And then I looked up. A family of crows tilted their heads down at me. One of them hopped along a branch, inspected me, and cawed, and the others followed suit. I don't think they meant anything bad, but they drew attention to me. Soon, that thing was coming my way. I tried to get away, but even at a sprint, I was nowhere near as fast. I remember something knocking me to the ground and putting a foot on my back. At least I think it was a foot. It was big enough to be a car tire. Something wrapped around my ankle and twisted, pulled, and twisted again. I'm not going to try and explain the pain of several compound fractures to somebody who's never broken a bone, but it's a terrifying violation. Your body is being woefully and forcefully disfigured in a way that it never has. That thing was tearing off my leg at the knee. And it did. I've experienced pain and fear before, but the mortality of imminent death is something that's hard to explain. It's in a category of its own. There's a searing pain in your nerves, an intense, scalding heat. And as that heat grows ever worse, the rest of your body grows cold. You start to focus on such pinprick, minute details. The exact shape of a leaf on the ground, the texture of a grain of sand. Your mouth turns dry as you realize that you can't force your eyes into focus. I was lying there on my stomach, my head to the side, bleeding out. The big thing lumbered away as someone joined me at my side. A man sat down in the grass, leaning against a tree. The crows didn't seem to react to him like they did with me. It was Uncle Jerry. No, they don't mean to do it. They're not even scared. It's just like clawing your way to the surface for air. It's what comes naturally. I couldn't answer. I was trying to conserve my breath. This happened to you too, he continued. Back when I went. My eyes rolled, looking for him. I saw his shape, but it was diffuse, transparent. They got most of me out before I caught hold. Cut the extra arms off and all, but a part of me is still in there, just a bit distant. I could hear something shuffling around in the field. Whatever did this to me was still out there. I'm not here to gloat, Jerry explained. I've had time to calm down, to come to terms with things. Your life is yours, and I accept that. Honestly, I'm just glad that we had a chance to talk. He leaned in close, stroking my hair. I remember back when I was small, crying in my mother's arms. He was the man on the table all those years ago. If you let me in, I'll make this work, just this once. What do you say? I couldn't say anything, but I didn't have to. He knew my answer. I would do anything for a couple more breaths. I felt my pulse slow. I could focus. Not just on a single straw of grass, but the whole field. I could wet my tongue and wipe the sweat from my brow. I scooched a little, expecting a fountain of pain from my missing leg, but nothing came of it. Looking down, I was fine. I had a new leg. The skin and hair of it looked a little darker, but it was a leg. It just wasn't mine. It took some time to get used to. By the time that I got up off the ground, the thing was still running through the fields, tearing up swaths of wheat and wailing at the top of its lungs. It would stop at times to cough and wheeze, looking up at the moon. It seemed fascinated by it, like it really enjoyed the outdoors while simultaneously letting out a terrified scream. Two wills, one body. I made my way back to the main road. There were more cars there, the ferrymen along with a couple of volunteers. They were armed. The headlights from their cars cast these long shadows, stretching down the road, highlighting the blood, some of which was mine, dripping from the torn edge of my pant legs. It's in the fields, I said, pointing. It's big. Just the one. Just one. They fanned out and readied their weapons. The last thing that I heard before they entered the wheat field was a silent, "Sorry, Harland." And seconds later, they were shooting. I sat down in my car, adjusting the seat to the new length of my leg. I heard the shooting, and then the shooting stopped. They burned something in the field and dragged the abandoned car off the road. A couple of days later, I talked to my aunt. She had confirmed that I had had an Uncle Jerry and that I had went to his funeral as a kid. That was the time that I caught Good Friday lung. Apparently, I was one of the first kids to survive it. She didn't want to get into specifics, but it had been violent. You have to do something terrible to stop it from expanding within a host. Researching it further, the best explanation of the condition is that a newly dead body sort of finds its way into a younger one, like a person desperate for air. Except two people can't inhabit the same space. It collides, creating something twisted and in between. It can be stopped if noticed immediately, but even then the chances are slim. I wrote a paper about it, but it was rejected. I had to go to one of my backup subjects. This was a couple of years ago, and I've tried to gain some legitimacy. I've had my leg tested, but they haven't found a reason why it looks so different, or is of a different length. Yes, at a glance, it looks like something just slap grafted onto my knee, but that explanation has been denied several times. There's no scar tissue, no mending marks on the bone, nothing. It's like it was supposed to be there. And of course, I wonder if this is going to happen to me someday. I was born there, but I haven't lived there. How can you know whether you're a part of this chain or not? You don't know for sure until you're gone, and by then, you're not experiencing anything. Or maybe in the case of Harland, you are. And do I want to? What's the alternative? I have plenty of years left to consider this, and I don't think that I'll ever have a clear answer. And just to be sure, I think that I'll have a final request upon my passing. Make sure my body is properly shrink-wrapped. This episode is sponsored by Rocket Money. So I'll be honest, I used to avoid looking at my finances altogether. Like I would swipe my card, hope for the best, and deal with it later. And later usually meant realizing that I was still paying for stuff that I completely forgot about. That's where Rocket Money came in. What I like is everything's just in one place. You can see all your subscriptions, your spending, and where your money is actually going. And if you spot something you don't want anymore, they can help you cancel it within the app with just a few taps. And they've already saved users over 880 million in canceled subscriptions. It also categorizes your spending automatically, so you start noticing patterns, like maybe you're spending way too much on takeout than you thought. You can set budgets, track goals, and even get alerts for big purchases or upcoming bills, which honestly helps avoid those "oh no" moments. If you've been putting off getting your finances organized, this is a really easy way to start. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps find and cancel unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills so that you can grow your savings. Let Rocket Money help you reach your financial goals faster. Join at rocketmoney.com/Mr. Krabs. That's rocketmoney.com/Mr. Krabs. rocketmoney.com/Mr. Krabs. My brother got married in the UK. I thought that was going to be the main takeaway of the trip. Either that or the absurd red-eye flight that I had to take to keep the trip under budget. And neither of those things turned out to be that consequential. It was a nice wedding, sure, and yeah, the trip was a pain in the butt. But it was what happened in the bathroom after the flight that turned out to change my life the most. After finishing my business and washing my hands, I looked up at the wide airport bathroom mirror and saw nothing. I took a step back and blinked a couple of times. I didn't register what was happening at first. It was barely a conscious thought. Something about my mirror image was off. As I twisted and turned, the image clicked. I couldn't see my own head. I inspected my neck. There was a flat patch of skin between my shoulders. I pulled down my t-shirt a bit and I felt something alien. My hand passed straight through my throat, or at least the space where my head ought to be. Turning left and right, I saw it in different angles. I figured it was some kind of digital trick screen. I closed my eyes and I felt around with my hand. My arm passed straight through my neck and face. Nothing but air. I closed my eyes for 10 seconds and I counted out loud. A stall opened a bit further down and a man stepped out. I think we had arrived in the same flight. Opening my eyes, I felt my heart skip a beat. The illusion was still there. No head. I turned to the man. "Excuse me," I said. "Is there something on my face?" He washed his hand and looked my way with a shrug. "It looks fine." "No, really, is there something wrong?" His reflection had a head, mine didn't. How could that be? I still had this hope that it was some kind of trick. He turned to me as he dried his hands and squinted a little. "Oh, wait," he mumbled. "How are you?" His eyes went wide. His pupils turned black. He stumbled backwards, almost tripping on his own feet. Leaning against the wall, he backed out of the bathroom, stammering all the way out the door. I took a couple of steps towards him and he broke into a full-on sprint. I followed and saw a dozen heads turn as this 50-something-year-old man threw his luggage away and beelined it for the exit, screaming at the top of his lungs. Security had to tackle him to the ground as plain white and blue shirts collapsed out of his carry-on. A couple of folks looked my way, but nobody reacted like he did. They didn't see it. Maybe they wouldn't unless I pointed it out, like I did to that man. Hell, those first few seconds, I hadn't noticed it myself. It's like I didn't want to see it. It's impossible to believe that your head is missing until you see it. And even then, how can you see it? What was I even seeing through? It didn't make any sense. I could see and blink, I could hear, I could turn my head. If I really concentrated, I could feel my hair touch the tip of my ears, but I couldn't see my head or touch it with my hands. I tried putting on headphones and they clattered to the bathroom floor. The necklace that I got from my mom slid right off the smooth patch of skin where my neck was supposed to be. And if I thought really hard about it, I could see through my own eyelids when I had imagined closing my eyes. I had a full-on breakdown in that bathroom. I was there for well over an hour. I tried throwing up in the trash can, but nothing happened. I just stood there making choking noises. I was breathing, my lungs were filling with air, I had a heartbeat. I was thinking, my head still worked. It just wasn't there. It was severed, missing, lost. I went outside to get an Uber. I was almost running, but I couldn't feel the rush of air. I had to get home. I couldn't get my phone to work, it just kept throwing errors. I hadn't even thought about that. I had Face ID. Looking at the screen, it showed the same empty neck that the bathroom mirror did. I couldn't unlock the thing. I ended up getting a cab. I don't remember what I said, but it must have been incomprehensible. The driver had to ask me to repeat myself 2 times. My hands were shaking so badly that it sounded like I was drumming on the car door. I could see it in the rearview mirror, or rather, I couldn't see it. Me, no head. The driver was chatting away. I think he noticed that I was having some sort of crisis and he tried to anchor me in the here and now. He talked out loud about whatever came to mind, maybe hoping that I would latch onto something. Problem was, I noticed that he was looking back in the rearview mirror. He was squinting, adjusting his vision as if taking a closer look. I thought about that man in the bathroom, and how he had reacted once he had realized that I was headless. He immediately panicked. I couldn't have my driver react like that at 55 miles per hour. I bent down, pretending to tie my shoes. My head should have bumped the back of the seat in front of me, but there was nothing there. I could move all the way to my neck stump. I felt the cool leather on my patch of neck skin. The driver turned back, looking straight ahead. I tried to act casual, but I was nearly pissing myself. I don't remember a word that he said. My mind was free-falling. There was immediate denial, of course. Maybe I was going insane, and that was a comforting thought. Maybe some kind of rare condition. There is face blindness, why not head blindness? But it didn't make sense, none of it. No matter my denial, I could physically touch the blank skin between my shoulders. I could scratch it, poke at it. If I pinched it, it stung. When I finally got home, I threw money at the driver and stumbled out of the car. I almost forgot my luggage. I dropped my keys on the gravel path leading up to the door and collapsed to my knees looking for them. I could barely think straight. I hurried inside, locked the door, and I ran into the bathroom. Still no head. This was my home and my mirror, and still nothing. I tried drinking a glass of water, but I ended up pouring it all over my clothes. I could feel my mouth, but it just wasn't there. I was so used to the sensation of having a head that I couldn't fathom not having it there. All my intuitive movements have always come from a place of fundamental understanding that no matter what, I'm a human, and I'm comprised of a certain set of parts. But now I couldn't make that distinction. I couldn't eat, I couldn't drink. I could wave my hand straight through where my eyes ought to be, and I didn't feel a thing. I stared at my hands for at least 30 minutes, trying to get them as close to my eyes as possible. It felt like I was squinting, as if preparing for a rough surface to touch my eyeball. But nothing happened. I just stared and felt nothing. I was experiencing and viewing the world through an organ that was not there. To say that I was freaking out would be an understatement. I was having a full-blown panic attack, the first one that I've ever had. I felt like my heart was trying to choke itself to death. I ended up lying on the floor, writhing around, trying to find an angle where I could feel my head. I prayed that it would bump against a chair or scratch against the floor. Something, anything. I remember lying there and crying for hours. I could feel the tears on my cheek, but I couldn't wipe them off. Maybe they weren't really there. If I thought about it hard enough, I could imagine that they weren't. After a while, I just lay there on my back staring at the ceiling. I was completely still, but I thought about my eyes. I was viewing the world from a place where they ought to be, but they weren't. And if I concentrated hard enough, I could change at that point of origin. It's like I could imagine my eyes being further from my body than they ought to be. If I had to describe the sensation, it was like an out-of-body experience. Like I was one flick of the imagination from turning my vision back at myself, seeing what I'd become. I don't know when I fell asleep, but at some point I did. I woke up a couple of hours later in a haze. I could feel something in my jaw, chewing. It's like a distant part of me was eating and drinking. I could feel my stomach growing full. I was awake, but it felt like a dream, like something else was doing it to me, through me. If I closed my would-be eyes, I could almost feel the taste. A hot dog, stale bread, ketchup, a lukewarm soda, maybe a cola. My stomach grumbled. It's like my body was rejecting it, like it wasn't sure that I was really eating or not, causing my stomach acid to perk up. A kind of Schrodinger's meal. I wasn't even sure if it was there or not, and there was no way for me to check. The sensation kept me up. My pulse refused to settle. I was lost inside my thoughts for about a day. I was trying to figure out some kind of logical explanation, but I couldn't come up with anything. I was able to do things that I wasn't supposed to. If I concentrated hard enough, I could make my vision drift. I could look around corners without moving my body. And the ultimate test, seeing through a door. It was hard. There was something inside your mind that stops you from trying the impossible. It's like when you force your eyes open underwater for the first time. It stings and burns and it aches, but you get past it. This felt the same way. I stood still and I forced my vision through, imagining my eyes on the other side of the door. After a couple of minutes, the darkness subsided, and I could see my living room from the kitchen through a closed door. Still, the moment I lost my focus, it all snapped back into place. I was so used to having my eyes right above my neck that my mind couldn't help but to default to that space. Maybe that's why I could see it all. Just like people ignored my lost head, maybe my body was experiencing a similar rejection and constructing an experience where there ought to be one. I took a couple of sick days and I closed myself off to the world. I went outside a couple of times to get some groceries and a new phone. I forgot that I couldn't eat. I tried to not pay attention to myself, but I couldn't help it. At some point, I saw a guy on the other side of the street looking my way. Maybe an acquaintance of mine or somebody who thought I was someone else. Either way, he looked a little too close, and the reaction was the same as I had seen before. Complete and immediate panic. He ran straight into oncoming traffic, trying to get away from me. Thank God the drivers were quick on the brakes. I had to do something. I was becoming a liability. I got one of those cheap, styrofoam model heads from a local Goodwill and I dressed it in a wig. I added a face mask, a big pair of sunglasses, and I put on a black hoodie. It took some time to get used to the balance and I had to adjust my vision with about an inch to get past the sunglasses, but it was frightening just how easy it came to me. It's like my senses were becoming more malleable. All the while, I kept getting the sensation of being full. Something was eating and it was going straight into me. At times, I would get hiccups as something cold rolled down my gullet. Some part of me was drinking. Coming back home, I tried to put together all that I had learned. I still had a head in some capacity, it just wasn't there. That meant that it had to be somewhere else. It was still eating and drinking, meaning that someone or something was using it in my stead, or at the very least, sustaining it. Not a comforting thought. People weren't expecting to see someone without a head. It was something so unreal and outlandish that their minds rejected it. All I had to do was make them look a little closer and they would just break. With my fake styrofoam hat along with some duct tape, I could pass for a normal person for a bit, at least long enough for people not to panic. Something abnormal had happened to me, and I noticed it for the first time in the airport bathroom. That meant that whatever happened to me must have taken place prior to that moment, and since nobody was screaming in fear at my brother's wedding, I had a window somewhere between saying goodbye and looking in the bathroom mirror. But what happened? Where? I decided that I couldn't do this alone. I needed some kind of anchor, so I called on a friend of mine, Eric. We met through work, but that was about 2 jobs ago. We kept in touch and hung out on the weekends mostly, but we had had our moments. He was a good guy, could be a bit of a geek at times, but as honest as they come. It felt weird to call him. I couldn't pinpoint where my ear was, so I ended up talking to him on speakerphone. It took 4 rings for him to pick up. Figures, it looked like an unknown number. "Eric, it's me," I said. "I could use your help." Sorry, I can't hear you. You sound weird." I closed my eyes and realigned. My mouth was off. I had to anchor it to where it ought to be. I tried to imagine it in my mind's eye, the shape of my lips as I talked. "Is that better?" "Oh, I guess so, yeah. What's up?" "Eric, something's come up and I could use your help." It took him a couple of seconds, but he could hear that I wasn't messing around. "Are you okay?" "Sort of, but not really. It's a whole thing. If you could drop by, maybe I could explain." "You need me to bring anything? Are you hurt?" I looked around, not by turning my head, but by rearranging the space where my eyes ought to be. It felt like swimming, but with my body standing still. I was getting better at it. "I'll need to show you something weird. Something really, really weird." Eric showed up in less than an hour. He's a mid-20s guy with a less than athletic build, thick glasses, and bulky clothes to hide an even bulkier physique. That said, the man was deceptively strong. I had seen him haul boxes on one shoulder like they were pillows. I invited him in and figured I would try and get him acclimated to my reality. Maybe I could get him past the initial panic. I asked him to put away his cell phone, glasses, and anything brittle. I was wearing my styrofoam hat and he didn't seem to notice. Maybe the mind just kind of fills in the blanks. I was improvising to the best of my ability, and Eric wasn't sure what to make of it. I was looking for something akin to rope, hoping that maybe I could tie him up, something to force him to stay when the panic set in. "What exactly are you doing?" he asked. "You're gonna want to leave when you see this. It's like a gut reaction and I'm looking for something to get you to stay." "Why would I leave? What is it?" "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." That wasn't entirely true. My instinct was to shake my head, but I ended up shrugging. I finished my thought. "I mean, you would believe me, but that's sort of the problem." It took some convincing, but we decided to go to his car. It was a controlled environment that made him feel a bit at ease. He handed me the keys, but stayed in the driver's seat. I was allowed to lock the doors, and then slowly I explained. "Something's happened to me, and I want you to know that this is not a hoax, not a trick, not a prank. This is real." "Okay, will you tell me what it is?" "I'll show you." I took off the strips of duct tape, folded the hoodie back, and removed the styrofoam hat. I put it on my lap and turned to him. For a moment, nothing happened. He looked at the head and then back at me. He reached out and touched the wig, making sure that it was, well, a wig. And then he stared at me. His eyes crept downward toward the base of my neck. A bead of sweat formed on his forehead, and his breath grew shorter. Without looking away, his hand fumbled for the door handle. "This is normal. This always happens. Try to stay calm." Eric couldn't speak. He kept making this coughing noise. He went from reaching for the door handle to smacking his hand against the window. On a whim, I grabbed his hand and placed it firmly on the base of my neck. His fingertips were cold. "It's real. It's really real." He shrieked. I've never heard a human make a sound like that before, and I couldn't believe that it was coming from a friend of mine. He smacked the window so hard that a crack formed and a spurt of blood shot out of his arm. I kept his hand on my neck and he scrambled to get away. After a couple of seconds, he managed to unlock the door. He rolled backwards, doubled over, and puked right there in the driveway. I think he was going through every stage of emotion at once. There was crying, screaming, a bit of laughter, and all the while these random words. "No, you can't just, how are you?" I got out, still holding the fake head like a Stone Age warrior carrying a trophy. Eric was crawling to get away, but he was getting slower. After a minute or so, he was out cold, fully and completely unconscious. I had to drag him inside. He woke up about 20 minutes later. I was the first thing that he saw. His face twisted and turned, not wanting to look at me. He closed his eyes, muttering and repeated, "No, no, no." "I'm sorry, Eric. Please look at me. I need your help." "I can't. You're not real. It's not real." "Look closer." He opened his eyes, still shaking his head, and slowly but surely I could explain to him what was going on. He wouldn't stop shaking. It was like he was running a fever, but as I explained what had happened, he began to recover. After a while, he could sit straight up. He could ask questions, and before long, I could show him the neck patch without him getting a stomach cramp. He didn't like looking at it, and we agreed that I would keep my fake head on for now. It was easier to stomach. I explained the situation, the time frame, and my suspicion that something had happened between one point to another. That and that I was experiencing something from another perspective, from another place. I was eating and drinking somewhere, somehow. Eric didn't like it, any of it. He didn't like talking about it, thinking about it, or looking at it. And despite all that, he dug his hands into his hair, closed his eyes, and forced himself to consider the options. "Wild animals don't buy hot dogs into Coke," he muttered. "Whoever's doing this is, at the very least, something that can pass for a person." "Yes," I blurted out. "Yeah, that's a good point." "Was there any time when you weren't paying attention? If somebody steals, they usually do it when you're not thinking about it." "Well, it was a red-eye flight. I was sleeping half the time." "Well, then it was probably somebody on the flight." Eric and I stayed there for a couple of hours, catching up and trying to make sense of things. He could barely wrap his head around half of what I was saying, but he was trying to look at it from a logical point of view. My head wasn't where it was supposed to be, so it had to be somewhere else. That made sense. Eric had a friend working at the airport, a high school buddy. It would take some convincing, but he figured that he could at least get us a foot in the door. There had to be some sort of footage that we could check. Eric made some calls and he was just happy to get out of the room for a while. I could hear a loud conversation from the other room, but Eric gave me a nod as he came back. "That's gonna cost me, but he can help. Just keep a low profile." If the surveillance footage could help us get a clearer picture of the last time one Ida had, that would close the gap significantly. It was a long shot, but it was a start. Eric had to sleep off a sudden headache, but his friend had the night shift anyway. We drove out there around midnight. It was a quiet ride. Eric refused to look at me. It was for the best. I wanted him to keep his eyes on the road. It was a pretty long ride and I found my thoughts drifting a little. As a playful test, I drifted my eyes out the side of the passenger window. It was weird seeing the world pass by so fast, unbound by anything resembling a physical body. I imagine that's what being a ghost would feel like. We got to the airport, parked, and waited for his friend to come meet us. The guy was about 6'3" and built like a barrel. There was barely time for introductions, we just waited until the coast was clear and he ushered us inside. The big guy put a hand to my chest, almost knocking over my styrofoam hat. I had to scramble to keep the tape in place. "You're not gonna do any crazy stuff, are you?" I wanted to shake my head, but I figured I wouldn't risk it. "No, sir," I said. "I need help finding someone." "Whatever." He shoved me inside and hurried down the corridor. Eric struggled to keep pace as he gave me an apologetic look. We ended up inside a security room. This wasn't one of the big airports where you have dozens of security personnel. This room only had space for 2. The big guy plopped down in an all too small chair and looked over his shoulder. "Alright, we got 10 minutes. I gave him the time and date. There were no cameras inside the bathrooms, but there was one in the hallway outside. Surveillance cameras have really bad quality though. They're meant for bulk collection over a long time. And the angle didn't help. Everything looks different from above. He managed to rewind to the correct date and time. As he scrolled through the footage, I noticed something on one of the cameras. Myself. We played the footage a bit when I noticed commotion in the background of the video. A couple of shirts flying through the air, changing the angle I got a better view. There was a 50-year-old man making a break for the exit at full sprint. "Hold on," I said. "I was in the bathroom when he flipped out." No, you're right there," Eric pointed. The security guy changed the screen, showing another angle. The time didn't match up. There I was on the screen leaving, and at the same time that I was in the bathroom. "Do you have a view outside the entrance?" I asked. "Could you see where he goes?" "I'll make it quick." He switched to camera 9 and I got a closer look. The head was clearly mine, but the rest didn't look quite right. The legs were slim and the arms seemed a bit too short. The torso was craned like that of an old man. It took some time to get used to the real image, but playing the footage back, you could clearly see something wasn't right. One arm was clearly shorter than the other, and the more I looked at it, the more I realized how wrong it was. Something took my head and wandered right out of the airport in broad daylight, and no one noticed, not even me. The security guy got out of his chair and hurried into the hallway. His walkie-talkie chimed. I could hear him meet someone outside as they engaged in casual banter. Eric looked around, trying to figure out what to do. We were clearly not supposed to be there. I positioned myself by the door and let my eyes drift sideways. Then my hearing. All of a sudden, it was like I was standing next to them. The two guards were chatting away. The big guy was convincing a smaller one to go get some snacks from the break room. They came to an agreement, but we wouldn't have much time. The moment they turned their backs, I tried snapping myself into place, but I couldn't. For a moment, I was too disoriented to find my way back. It's like I had stretched a line too far and it had snapped. I was drifting, unblinking from where I was supposed to be. It felt like trying to balance a bar of soap on wet ice. Somewhere far away, I felt Eric take my hand and pull me away. I heard a distant voice. I tried to find my way back, zipping through airport crowds, through doors and walls and windows, all the way up in the ceiling and halfway into the floor. In less than a heartbeat, I could be inside, outside, above or below. Sounds distorted as an amalgamation of blurred voices melded together into a general human soup. And somewhere in that buzz of sensation was Eric calling out to me. I focused, I followed it. I made the tiniest move towards it and felt something snap back into place like a magnet. "Do you hear me?" Eric repeated. "Are you in there?" "I don't know," I gasped. "I don't know, I'm losing it. I think I'm losing it. Let's get you home." I didn't even realize that we were in his car. He must have dragged me through the entire building. On our way back, I could feel myself growing full and satiated. Someone was eating, feeding me. "Someone wore my head," I said out loud. My voice was a bit off, but I adjusted. "Someone who walked out the door," Eric added. "Maybe they didn't get very far." "What do we do? Check every taxi company in town and hope for cameras." "First things first, what happened in there?" "It's my eyes. They're off." "Off how?" I didn't know how to explain it. How do you explain being unbound to a physical body? Non-locality, superpositions. I had no idea. I tried to find the words, but it just came out as a grumble. Eric tapped me on the shoulder. "Hey, we'll figure it out." Eric crashed on the couch that night. I tried to get some sleep, but it's like my head didn't need it. My body was exhausted, but part of me just wasn't. I couldn't trick myself into thinking that I had eyelids anymore. I couldn't yawn. I tried to get comfortable, but I just ended up letting my senses drift. I could hear cars passing as my hearing reached the highway. Streetlights passed by so fast, they looked like a straight line. I heard a conversation inside a dark apartment. Two people whispering intimate nothings like there was nobody else in the world. But I was right there with them. And then a thought. What if I could find what my eyes were really seeing? I sat up and tried anxiety and accept whatever sensation came to me. I could feel eating. Maybe that was a place to start. I focused on the taste in my mouth and the smell in the air. Tobacco. I closed my imagined eyes and looked for something real. Something that ached and stung. Some place where I could blink. An image. A laughing woman. Blue neon lights with a sunflower motif surrounded by a stylized cartoon hippo. Some kind of club. My eyes burned like I had drenched them in salt water. I tried calling out to Eric, but the image remained. the woman turned to me. "Eric?" The woman scoffed. "I look like an Eric to you." I snapped back to my bedroom. I was saying Eric over and over. He was already coming in, yawning with every step. I grabbed a pen and a paper, drawing the cartoon hippo to the best of my ability. This, I said, throwing the paper at him. "I saw this." "You sure?" "Yeah," I said, trying instinctively to nod. "It's here." "Oh, that's not far, about 2 streets down from my place." "We gotta go. Please, we gotta go." Eric yawned again and nodded. Tired or not, he was not about to miss a lead. We got back on the road as I fumbled to get the styrofoam head back on. I was out of duct tape and ended up throwing it haplessly into the back seat. Eric tried his best not to look, but I could tell that he wasn't okay. Every time he looked at my empty neck, he shuddered. He was right. The place wasn't far off. A downtown dance club. I had never been there, Eric hadn't either, but he saw it every day on his way home from work. He had always liked the logo, I think. We managed to find a parking spot about a block away, and we made our way on foot past old brick buildings and chain-linked fences. The place had already closed for the night, but only recently. There were still drunks outside, smoking in the blue neon glow. We didn't have much time. If something with my head had been there, it couldn't be far off. Looking a little closer, I noticed a woman in the crowd. I recognized her from the vision. I walked up to her as she finished a cigarette. "Excuse me," I said. "You were talking to somebody just now. Where'd he go?" "You know him?" It was weird hearing her voice again. The moment I did, I could feel something in the back of my mind, like a tickle, an echo. Like my imagined ears and real ears had synchronized for a moment, causing a sort of mental feedback loop. It subsided after about a second. Eric stepped in, pushing me aside. We're giving him a ride. You know where he went." She pointed a finger down the street. Eric grabbed my arm as the pain in my head settled into a quiet lull. The woman shrugged us off as our jog had turned into a run. Hard steps on harder concrete, rounding a corner, crossing an alleyway, taking a sharp left. All of a sudden, there was a figure standing under the streetlight. At first sight, he wasn't anything special. Just a guy. Brown hair, average build, average height. I almost missed him until I looked a little closer. Eric kept running, but I grabbed him by the arm, tugging him back. The man under the streetlight was not as ordinary as he had first seemed. His legs were too thin and his arms too short. His head slightly bigger and younger than his crooked torso. He turned to us. I could feel something strange. There was a connection there. I could imagine myself blinking and see it on his face. On my face. We stood there for a moment as a car turned in. The man waved it off. As the car sped off, he stepped out of the light and came closer to us. There was more of him to see. Strange appendices reaching out of his back. A collection of heads hanging from his belt. In one moment, he gave off the impression of an elegant woman in a ball gown. In the next, he was a dock worker. I think that I might have seen one of them on the flight. And then it turned into me. He stopped a couple of steps away. Eric was barely breathing. The air trembled as the distance between that thing and I felt magnetic, like something would snap if it got too close. "I'll go home," the thing suggested, its words spoken on my tongue. I could feel it. I wasn't prepared for that. It felt strange in my mouth. "I need that back," I said, swallowing hard. "I need me back." "You don't," it said. "You'll grow old. Ugly." That's not for you to decide. I reckon. It looked at Eric but turned away. I don't think it liked his glasses. Instead, it trained its eyes on me, my eyes. And every now and then that sight bled through, making me see myself through a fleeting image, like two lives superimposed. It stepped a little closer, not out of malice but curiosity. It was almost within a misshapen arm's reach. "How do you do it?" I asked, my words reflected. "How do you do this?" "Oh, we just trying to find ourselves." "You can't just take what's mine. You can't do that." "What makes it yours?" "It's me and that's my head. I was born with it." "Well, that don't make it yours." "Of course it does. What are you talking about?" I leaned in closer, letting my own voice speak directly into the empty vacancy of my would-be face. "Just because you have something don't mean you'll always have something." It pushed me away and started walking. Eric snapped out of his fear and hurried to stop it, only to get thrown 8 feet straight across the road, rolling into a wall. There was no way that I could stop this thing. I figured I would try something else. I closed my eyes as hard as I could. I let that flow in the air grab a hold of me, forcing the eyes of my head shut. I heard a snap of bone as something fell over, but no squelch of pain. Instead, there was a sudden tug. There was a strange crunch as something changed. The voice, it was different. "Fine," it said. "Let's see what you do with it." I felt the breeze on my face as my head was casually thrown to the pavement. With nothing to catch me, I suffered a severe and immediate concussion along with a broken nose. The last thing that I remember from that night was looking up, my eyes crossed, seeing something large lumbering down the street. It was shifting from one head to another, trying to find just the right one. It took some time to get used to having my head back. It snapped onto my shoulders like it never left. The concussion didn't help. The broken nose kept me up for weeks. Eric was mostly fine, just a sprained shoulder. I thought that I would have to pay him back, but it's like most of what happened has completely slipped his mind. He seems to be forgetting it. Maybe there's some kind of inherent mechanism inside all that forces us to not acknowledge when the world works in ways that it shouldn't. That said though, I paid him back plenty. He's a good guy. I've wondered what part of those days was real and what wasn't. Could I really look through doors? Did I see something wearing my hat? It doesn't feel real, it can't be. And still, I know that it is. There's almost a fog that drifts in when you accept that your senses and memories are fallible. You want them to lie to make things soft. I'm writing this down to remember. If I don't, there's no telling what might happen in the future. If that thing decides that I'm worth the bother, I don't know what I could do to stop it. If I try to remember, I could be ready. And even if I'm not, I think I need to consider that the world doesn't always function by the rules that I'm comfortable with. There's more to life than rules. If I consider that and accept it, I can look myself in the mirror and feel something happening. And for a moment, there's a drift, just half an inch, maybe less, where my vision moves from the reality of my eyes. And I know that if it just goes a little bit further, something will break forever. But maybe that's what's supposed to happen. This episode is sponsored by Quince. Lately, I've been trying to simplify my day-to-day, especially when it comes to what I wear. I don't want to overthink outfits, I just want stuff that feels comfortable but still looks put together. And that's honestly why I've been liking Quince. Quince makes it really easy to refresh your everyday wardrobe with pieces that feel as good as they look. They use premium materials like 100% European linen, organic cotton, and really soft denim, but without the crazy price tags. And one thing that really stood out to me was their denim. It has that structured feel that you want, but it's still super comfortable. And when I saw the price, I actually had to double check it, because it didn't match what I had expected for that quality. They've got lightweight linen pants, tops, stuff that you can just throw on and wear all day. And a lot of their pieces start around $30, which is kind of wild considering everything is priced 50 to 80% less than similar brands. They work directly with ethical factories and cut out the middleman, so you're just paying for the quality itself. If you want to upgrade your wardrobe without overcomplicating it, this is a really easy place to start. Refresh your every day with luxury that you'll actually use. Head to quince.com/MrCreeps for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada too. That's QUINCE.com/MrCreeps for free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/MrCreeps. The Reddit thread was buried under 40-something replies and I almost missed it. My phone was at 12% and the cheap IKEA lamp on my desk was doing the thing where it flickered every few minutes without actually going out. And I was tired enough that I had been scrolling for about an hour without reading anything. The post had no title, just a username, a throwaway account created that day, and a block of text that read like somebody had typed it fast and not gone back. My friend went in 3 days ago. He said that he found a way into the old Harwick facility off Route 9 past the county line. I have the coordinates that he sent to me. He kept texting updates for the first hour and then the messages stopped except for one at 2 in the morning when he just said, "The lower levels aren't on any of the floor plans that I found. There's something wrong with the way the tunnels are laid." That was it. Cut off mid-sentence. I read it twice. My first assumption was ARG, an alternate reality game, some elaborate thing with planted accounts and fake distress signals. The writing had that quality to it, the kind of breathless urgency that usually means someone put a lot of effort into making it look effortless. I almost kept scrolling, but then I copied the coordinates into Google Maps because I was already awake and there was nothing else to do, and the pin landed on a real place. A result from a historical preservation database. Harwick Signal Processing Facility, decommissioned in 1987. Federal ownership transferred to county land management in 1993. There was one photograph attached to the record. Concrete structures half buried, chain link perimeter fencing. The photo was dated 2004. I went back to the thread. Someone 3 replies down had written, "The eastern access point has been sealed since at least 2019. I drove out there last fall. If this is real, those seals are open." Another reply under that. "Check the second access on satellite. Something's different." And then a reply from the original poster, timestamped 4 hours after the first. "He still hasn't answered. I don't know what to do." I sat with that for a minute. The lamp flickered. And then I refreshed the page and the thread was gone. Not deleted with a mod note, not locked, just gone like it had never been there. I checked my browser history. I clicked back through it and got a Reddit 404. The throwaway account came up as suspended when I searched for the username directly. I should have gone to sleep. I know that, but instead I sat there at my desk while my phone died and thought about the coordinates, which I had already written down on the back of a gas station receipt, because I have a habit of doing that. And I thought about the last message cutting off mid-sentence. and I thought about the reply saying the access point shouldn't be open. I left at 5:30 in the morning. I'm not reckless. I want to be clear about that because what comes next is going to sound like I am. I packed deliberately and took my time doing it. I found the Streamlight flashlight that I had bought 2 years ago for a camping trip that I ended up not taking, and checked the batteries and packed 2 sets of spares in a Ziploc bag and put that in the front pocket of my backpack where I could get to it fast. Water, energy bars, a paper printout of everything that I could find about the facility in the hour that I spent searching before I left. I had the screenshot of the coordinates and I had a rough idea of the layout from a military-based decommissioning document that I found on a government archive site. 2 above-ground levels, at least 1 sublevel, connected by a central stairwell. The gun, I debated for longer than I want to admit. It's a Glock 19 that I've had for 3 years. I'd put probably 4,000 rounds through it at the range. I'm not careless with it, I keep it cleaned and I know how it works. I stood in my kitchen holding it and I thought, you're going to a place where somebody might be hurt and needs help, or you're going to a place where something is wrong in a way that you don't understand yet. Either way, I took it. I holstered it on my hip under my jacket, not in the bag, somewhere that I could reach it without thinking. I drove out, and just as it was getting light. Route 9 past the county line is the kind of road that used to go somewhere, and now just connects 2 stretches of nothing. The gravel access track wasn't marked. I almost missed the turnoff and had to reverse 30 feet to find it. And it was rougher than it looked on satellite, and deep ruts that bottomed out my car twice before I parked under a stand of scrub pines and got out. The air smelled like damp soil and something faintly metallic underneath, though I wasn't sure yet if that was the facility or just the morning. The fence was chain link, 8 feet, and it had been cut. The edges of the cut section had oxidized to a dull brown and the flap had been folded back and more or less stayed there, bent into shape by repeated use. I went through it crouching, my backpack catching once on a wire, and I came out on the other side into a lot that had been paved at some point and wasn't anymore. The asphalt buckled and split by decades of frost and root growth. There were 4 concrete structures visible from where I stood. 2 looked like equipment housings, low and lidded, the kind of thing you would see at a water treatment plant. One was bigger, maybe 20 by 40 feet, with narrow rectangular windows that had been bricked in. The 4th was partially buried in the hillside to the north, just a facade of poured concrete with a heavy door at the center. The warning signage was still there, mounted to posts that had rusted through at the base and leaned at angles that made them mostly illegible. I could read, authorized personnel, on one and trespassing on another, and that was about it. The ground between the structures was overgrown, hip-high grass gone dry and yellow, and the whole place had the quality of somewhere that had been left alone long enough that nature was in the middle of deciding whether to absorb it or not. Not dramatic decay, just a slow and indifferent erasure. The bunker door on the hillside was the one from the photograph. It was a sloped steel door, double panel, set into the concrete at about a 30-degree angle, and it was open. Not all the way, maybe 18 inches. Enough to get through it if I went sideways. And it had been open long enough that the edges had started to corrode where they met the frame. I stood in front of it for a moment. There was nothing really ominous about it. It was just a door that was open when it probably shouldn't be. I looked back once, the way that I had come. The pines, the gravel track, the gray morning sky with some low cloud cover moving in from the west. And then I turned on the streamlight, angled myself sideways, and I went in. and the air changed immediately. It dropped maybe 10 degrees in the space of a step, and the stale quality of it was hard to describe. Not rotting, more like sealed, like the air in a room that had been closed for years and then opened. There was something metallic underneath it, faint. The sound changed too. The ambient outdoor noise cutting off almost completely the moment that I had cleared the door, replaced by a low silence that had a density to it, if that makes sense. Like the quiet in the room after a sound stops. I paused, and just inside to let my eyes adjust to the flashlight beam. Stone steps descended about 15 feet to a landing and then continued. The walls were poured concrete, rough with conduit running along the left side and a handrail on the right that had pulled partially away from the wall. I tested the first step with my weight and then the second. They were solid. I went down. Behind me, the door shifted. I heard it, a low scraping sound as it moved maybe an inch further closed. I turned and looked at it. It sat slightly more closed than before, probably just from the pressure change of me entering. I watched it for a few seconds and it didn't move again. I turned back and kept going. The first level was offices. A central hallway maybe 60 feet long with doors on both sides, most of them opened, a few pulled shut. The floors were linoleum, gray and green, coated in dust that had settled so evenly and completely that it looked like paint. I moved slowly, checking each room as I passed. Standard office furniture, metal desks, filing cabinets, rolling chairs overturned or shoved into corners. One room still had paper in a wire basket on the desk, fused together by moisture and time into a single, solid mass. Another had a bulletin board on the wall with a few papers, a thumbtack to it, unreadable. The dust on everything was undisturbed. Perfectly, uniformly undisturbed. And that layer of settled time that tells you nobody has been in a room for a very long while. I was taking inventory in a way, I think, cataloging the ordinary to reassure myself. This is just a building. This is just a place where people used to work. The second level was accessed through a stairwell at the end of the hall, and it was different in the way that institutional spaces are different from each other. Same materials, different function. Barracks mostly. A long room with bed frames lined up, mattresses either gone or rotted through, personal storage lockers along one wall. Some of the lockers were open and some were closed. One had a boot inside it, a single combat boot. The leather gone stiff and the laces snapped. On the floor near the far end of the room there was a playing card face down in the dust. I didn't pick it up. Another room off the barracks had shelving units, half of them collapsed, and wooden crates that had broken apart under their own weight over the years. Standard stores, most of it unidentifiable now. I found a sign mounted above a doorway that read, "Lower Complex Access, Authorized Personnel Only, Level 3 Clearance Required." The door beneath it was locked, and the elevator shaft was around the corner from it. The doors closed, and when I tried them, firmly sealed. I could get my fingers in the gap, but nothing moved. But there was a stairwell door next to the elevator, and that one opened. I stood in the doorway and I pointed the flashlight down. The stairs continued in a single straight run, no switchback, descending maybe 30 feet to where the beam ran out of reach. The air coming up from below was heavier, not colder exactly, but heavier, like a column of air had more weight to it. I held my hand near the gap and I felt a faint movement, not a draft exactly, more like pressure equalizing slowly. I had the handgun ready and I started down. The stairwell was narrower than the ones above. My shoulders were close to both walls simultaneously, and the ceiling dropped a foot or so partway down, which I noticed by almost hitting my head. The sound of my footsteps was close and echoless, absorbed by the concrete rather than bouncing back, which was disorienting in a low-grade way I noticed without being able to fully articulate. About 2/3 of the way down, I slowed. The dust pattern was wrong. On the levels above, the dust was even. Years of settled accumulation, flat and uniform. Here it was different. The center of each step had less buildup, and along the edges where the step met the wall there were smudge marks, irregular like something had brushed against the wall repeatedly in the same spots. My mind translated it slowly. Foot traffic. Recent enough that the dust hadn't resettled. Recent enough to matter anyway. I stopped on the landing and crouched to look more carefully. A footprint, partial, in the thin layer of dust on the landing floor. Boot tread, heel end, a partial midfoot. The toe end obscured by a scuff mark. I didn't recognize the pattern as matching my own boot, and I hadn't come this far yet anyway. The thought that I had was direct and not complicated. Somebody came down here recently and this place hasn't been abandoned the way that I thought it was. I held the information and stood there in the silence and listened to it more carefully than I had been. I kept going down. The corridor at the bottom was long, longer than anything on the levels above, and it ran straight into the edge of my flashlight beam, which in this space felt like a shorter distance than it actually was. The ceiling was lower here, maybe 7 feet, and the conduit along the walls was heavier gauge and more of it, bundled in places and running in several directions. Institutional green paint on the walls, chipped and damp in places where moisture had found a way in. The dust on the floor here was disturbed in a path down the center of the corridor. Not footprints exactly, more like a general displacement, as though something had moved repeatedly through the space and the dust had been pushed aside and not resettled. I kept to the edge of the corridor, both to avoid stepping in the disturbance and out of an instinct that I didn't fully examine. The wall scraping marks started about 30 feet in. They were at shoulder height or roughly shoulder height, irregular, some shallow, some cut deeper into the paint and the concrete beneath, horizontal in orientation but not consistent, not like a pipe had been dragged along the wall, more like something with multiple contact points had moved against it. I touched one with 2 fingers. The edges were dry and had collected a thin layer of fine dust, which told me they weren't made this morning but didn't tell me much else. 20 feet further, the path on the floor widened and changed character. 2 tracks now parallel with heavier displacement. Drag marks. Something heavy had been moved through here, repeatedly or once in a way that required a significant force. I crouched down and moved the flashlight beam slowly along the floor, and the shape of it was clear. 2 channels, maybe 2 feet apart, continuous. I followed them with my eyes as far as the beam reached, and then I saw the smear on the wall and I initially registered it as rust. The facility had enough oxidation on the hardware and conduit fittings that it was plausible, and I kept moving for another 2 or 3 steps before something made me stop and go back to it. It was at arm height on the right wall. I put the flashlight close to it. The color was wrong for rust. Rust goes orange and then brown and then almost black over time. And this was darker at the edges and had the kind of peripheral smearing pattern that rust doesn't make. I touched the edge of it with 1 finger. Dry, old enough to be dry, but the color when I licked at my fingertip was a dark rust red, and I stood there for a moment and accepted what I was looking at. Blood. Old blood, but blood. I wiped my finger on my jeans and kept moving. I mean, what else was I going to do? And the blood became more frequent past that point, and the pattern of it changed. First, small drops on the floor, the kind that fall from a wound while somebody is moving rather than standing still. Then smears on the wall irregular at different heights, which meant whatever made them was moving in an uncontrolled way, stumbling or being moved. A handprint on the left wall, complete, palm and fingers at about chest height, and then a second handprint lower like somebody sliding down. The handprints were human-sized, and that registered as a specific kind of reassurance that lasted about 10 seconds before I noticed the third mark, which was also a handprint but larger. The palm spread too wide and the fingers disproportionately long, outside the range of normal human proportions. I stopped and looked at it for a moment. I was aware of my breathing. I tried to keep it even. The sound started while I was still crouched near the handprint, faint at the far edge of hearing, filtered through a lot of concrete, a groaning but not consistent. It came in bursts, 3 or 4 seconds of sound and then a gap and then more. It was wet somehow. The quality of it had a moisture to it, like the sound was coming through tissue as much as through air. I stood up slowly and didn't move. My hand was already moving to the gun before I made a conscious decision about it, fingers finding the grip. I stood in the corridor and listened, and the sound came again, further down and then again, and I waited through 4 or 5 cycles of it with my hand on the gun and the flashlight pointed at the middle distance. The corridor stayed empty. Whatever was making the sound wasn't in it or wasn't visible in the corridor, which at that moment felt like an important distinction. I drew the gun and held it at a low ready, and I started walking again. The corridor opened into a junction room at what I estimated was about 120 feet from the stairwell. The ceiling went up here maybe 12 feet and the space was maybe 30 feet across. A hub, the kind of room where hallways from multiple directions converge. There were 3 other corridor openings visible, 2 on the far side and 1 to my left. My flashlight caught it before I understood what I was seeing, which is its own kind of experience, the data arriving before the interpretation. The beam swept across something in the right half of the room and I stopped walking, and I let the light sit on it, and I stood there for probably 5 seconds just processing. At first, it looked like insulation. The room had some collapsed ceiling sections in the upper levels, and there was loose material and debris in places, and my brain made that guess quickly. But insulation doesn't stretch between walls. Insulation doesn't have that quality of tension, that taut anchoring at multiple points. What I was looking at was fibrous and red. Not red like rust and not red like paint. Red in a way that living tissue was red. And it was stretched across most of the right side of the room in thick strands, anchored to the wall on one side and to the section of the exposed conduit rack on the other, and to the ceiling at multiple points that I couldn't fully map. The strands were thick in places, finger width, and in other places thinner, almost translucent, and they caught the flashlight beam in a way that made the whole structure seem faintly luminescent at the edges. I stood at the entrance to the room and I looked at it, and then I saw the man inside it. He was suspended maybe 3 feet off the ground. The webbing, I'm going to call it webbing because I don't have another word, it was wrapped around him in a way that wasn't random. The strands running under his arms and across his chest and around his legs in a pattern that looked almost structural, like a specific configuration rather than something that had grown around him. His clothes were partially visible. Dark jacket, jeans, 1 boot. The strands crossed his face in 2 places, which is the detail that I remember most clearly. He was tilted slightly backward, head dropped toward his left shoulder. He was twitching. Small movements, rapid, primarily in his hands and in the muscles of his shoulders. The kind of movement that didn't correspond to breathing and didn't correspond to any deliberate action. Just small, continuous, and involuntary movement. His chest was rising and falling, so he was still alive, but the twitching had a different rhythm than the breathing. It was unrelated to it. The groaning was coming from him. I understood that now. It came in those bursts, not because something was intermittent, but because he was exhaling in bursts, pressure-driven, like the process of breathing was only partially under his control. I took a step into the room. My flashlight was on him and I was watching the webbing, looking for movement in it. Because if this structure was biological, then it might respond to stimulation, and I wasn't going to step into the middle of it without knowing that. The webbing didn't move. The man's twitching continued. I took another step and my angle changed and I could see his face more clearly. His eyes were open and they were tracking me. Not turned toward me, but tracking, following my movement as I came closer, the eyes moving slowly in the sockets. His mouth opened slightly as I got within 10 feet of him. The movement of his jaw was slow and effortful, like moving through resistance, and nothing came of it except a change in the quality of the sound. The groaning shifted slightly. It became something with more shape to it, the way that sound becomes speech before it becomes words. I had the thought, very quickly and without spending much time on it. He's trying to tell me something and he can't. I had a second thought immediately after, which was that I needed to understand the structure of what he was in before I went any closer, because stepping into a system that I didn't understand would be the kind of mistake that didn't fix itself. Something shifted in the webbing. Not a lot, just a slight change in tension. A tremor that moved through several strands at once, outward from somewhere toward the upper right portion of the structure where the strands were anchored to the ceiling. The man's twitching changed quality. It became more agitated. His mouth opened further and his eyes stayed on me. The screech was immediate and directionless, which is the worst quality a sound can have in an enclosed space. I couldn't locate it. I couldn't determine if it was coming from above me or behind the webbing or from one of the corridor openings. And in the half second that I spent trying to determine that, the movement started. It came off the ceiling, or it had been on the ceiling and I hadn't seen it because the flashlight had been on the man, and I hadn't swept the upper register of the room carefully enough. It dropped to the webbing first, landing on it with enough weight that the whole structure shuddered and the man inside it convulsed sharply, and then it oriented toward me. I want to describe it accurately because I've been over it many times since and I want to be precise. The body was wrong from the first moment. Too many joints in the limbs and the limbs themselves arranged at angles that legs and arms shouldn't make, the way that an insect is constructed rather than the way that a vertebrae is. It was larger, maybe 4 feet at the body, and the abdomen was swollen and asymmetrical, heavier on one side. The limbs I counted as 6 in the first second, might have been more. They were long and jointed twice, and they gripped the webbing and the wall surface with a faculty that came from having the right kind of anatomy for that, not from effort. The head was attached to the abdomen, and I mean that specifically, not to the front of the body where a head should be, but to the swollen underside of the abdomen, the face pointing downward and outward. The skin of the face was stretched over the underlying structure in a way that skin isn't supposed to stretch, tight in some places and loose in others, and the face was recognizable as a human face. The eyes moved, independently of each other and independently of the direction that the body was oriented. The eyes moved. The mouth was moving too, the lips making slow, repeated shapes. and the sound coming from it was a low, nearly continuous murmur underneath the main sound that the creature was producing. It adjusted its position on the webbing. 2 limbs lifted, repositioned, set down again. The head rotated toward me slightly, the eyes finding me in a way that involved turning the eyes rather than the face. And then it went still. I don't know how long the pause lasted, maybe 3 seconds, maybe 5. It was oriented toward me and it was looking at me, and it was absolutely still except for the movement of the mouth and eyes. The webbing around the man trembled with a low, continuous vibration. The man's twitching had become something closer to a full-body convulsion, rhythmic, coordinated with a pattern that I couldn't identify. And then it moved. I fired twice before I was fully conscious of having made the decision to fire. Both shots were at the body mass, and the sound of the shots in that room was like a physical impact. I felt it in my chest and in my sinuses, and the echoes didn't resolve cleanly. They just accumulated. I don't know if I hit it. The creature was already moving when I fired, and it moved in a way that I have trouble tracking in memory. Not fast in a linear sense, more like it had multiple options and it was using all of them. 2 limbs on the wall and 2 on the ceiling, and 1 or 2 on the webbing structure, and it was using all of those pathways at once, which made tracking it with a gun almost impossible. I backed up and my heel caught something on the floor. I looked down for 1 second and it was a smear of blood and my boot had gone through it, and I nearly went down. I caught myself on the wall with my left hand and I pushed off and got moving again. The junction room was behind me and I was back in the corridor. The 3rd shot I fired was at the ceiling junction where the corridor met the room, in the direction of movement, and when I fired it I heard a sound from behind me, from a man in the webbing, that I won't describe in detail except to say that it wasn't pain. It was the wrong kind of sound for pain. It was more like a response, like a signal. The creature dropped from the ceiling to the floor of the corridor. It hit wrong. 1 limb buckled and it scrabbled to right itself, which was the only time it moved inelegantly. And in that second, I was moving fast and I had maybe 30 feet of a lead. The thing about running in a 7-foot ceiling concrete corridor with a flashlight is that the light doesn't go around the person carrying it. So every time I turned to check behind me, I lost the beam in front of me for a moment and ran blind for 2 or 3 steps. I did this twice. Both times the beam came back to empty corridor, but the sound of movement behind me, limbs on concrete, a scraping that was both limb tips and the bulk of the body brushing the wall. It was continuous and not far enough away. I hit a side corridor on the right that I didn't remember from my way in. The decision to take it was more spatial than strategic. It was there and I was already past the turn and I took it and committed. This corridor was shorter and ended in a T-junction that wasn't on my mental map of the facility at all, which told me that I had gone wrong somewhere in my orientation. Maybe when I had been moving sideways in the junction room, maybe just from the adrenaline compressing my spatial memory. I stood at the T-junction and the streamlight chose that moment to flicker. 1, 2, 3, a strobe that lasted maybe 2 seconds. And in the gaps, I was in complete and total darkness, and the sound of movement behind me was coming from the corridor that I had just come down. The flashlight came back. I took the left passage and I committed to it. The left passage bent slightly after about 20 feet and opened into another corridor that I recognized. The conduit arrangement on the ceiling was the same as what I had walked under on the way in. Heavier gauge bundled to the left, single runs breaking off every 10 feet or so. I was back on the main stretch, or close to it, and I could feel the direction of the stairwell even if I couldn't see it yet. Behind me, from somewhere in the side passage, I heard a sound that was different from the limb scraping. It was the human sound, the murmur from the face on the abdomen, but louder now and with a rhythm to it. And underneath it there was a wet clicking that I associated with the mouth moving too fast and too much. And then it layered back into the scraping, closer, and I stopped trying to map it and just run. The stairwell door was where I had left it. I hit it with my shoulder and it opened, and I was on the stairs taking them fast. Hand on the rail because the flashlight was bouncing and the steps were irregular, and a fall here would be the end of it. I stumbled 4 steps from the top, my knee hitting the edge of a step hard enough that I felt it all the way to my hip, and I grabbed the rail and hauled myself up and through the doorway at the top. The second level. Barracks, storage, the boot in the locker. I kept moving. The sounds from below had changed. The scraping had stopped and been replaced by something else. A resonance that came through the floor rather than through the air, like movement translated into vibration in the concrete. I couldn't tell if it was getting closer. I moved like it was. First level, offices, filing cabinets. The dust that I had thought was reassuring 40 minutes ago. The main corridor at a run, my footsteps loud and unavoidable. The stairway up to the entrance. I went up the stairs 3 at a time with my hand dragging along the right wall for contact and orientation. And then the door in the gray morning light and the cool damp air outside hitting my face like surfacing from water. I was through the door and 10 feet out before I slowed down. And then I stopped. I stood in the overgrown lot between the concrete structures and I breathed and I listened. The outside sounds came back. Wind in the dry grass, a bird somewhere in the pines, distant road noise from Route 9. The door behind me sat slightly more open than I had left it, maybe from my coming through, and I watched it for a long moment. The dark behind it was just the dark inside a building with no windows, I told myself, and the door sat still. I walked back through the cut fence to where I had parked. My knee was starting to register properly now, a deep bruise at minimum, and my hands were shaking in a way that had started at some point in the last few minutes and hadn't stopped. I sat in the driver's seat and set the gun on the passenger seat and put both hands flat on my thighs, and I worked on breathing normally until the shaking had reduced to something manageable. And then I drove. I didn't look at the facility in the rearview. I just drove. I was home by 9 in the morning. I changed my clothes and made coffee that I didn't drink, and I sat at the desk where I had been sitting when I had first read the thread. And I went through the sequence of events in my head while it was still fresh, trying to encode the physical details before they faded or got contaminated by the way that memory works. By the way the brain starts to work on things and smooth the rough edges into something more coherent than what actually happened. I thought about the original post, the friend who went in 3 days ago, the text cutting off. I thought about the thread being deleted while I was reading it, and whether that was a coincidence or wasn't. I was pulling off my jacket when I noticed it. On the right sleeve, near the cuff, there was a strand. Thin, maybe 4 inches long, and the same red as what I had seen in the junction room. I must have brushed against some part of the webbing without registering it. I pinched it between my thumb and finger and tried to roll it off the fabric. It didn't come loose. The texture of it was slightly tacky and it had caught in the weave of the jacket in a way that wasn't immediately separable from just pulling at it. I pinched harder and pulled and it stretched. It stretched considerably further than a 4-inch strand should stretch, thinning as it extended, becoming almost translucent at maximum extension. And I kept waiting for it to snap, and it didn't snap until I had pulled it almost a full foot from where it had been attached to the sleeve. The end of it, when it finally gave, curled back in on itself slightly before going still. I put the jacket in a garbage bag and put the garbage bag outside the apartment door. I showered and tried to eat something, and I mostly managed it. I told myself what had happened had a physical explanation even if I didn't have all of it yet. That whatever I had seen was a thing that existed in the world and could therefore be understood. And that the man in the webbing might be retrieved by somebody with more resources and preparation than I had. That there were people who needed to know about the facility. I sent an email. I don't know who to exactly. I found a contact address for a federal land management office and wrote a brief account, and I sent it, and I don't know what happens to those emails or if anybody reads them. But I saved the coordinates in 3 places. I went to sleep around noon. The sleep was heavy and without dreams, the kind of sleep that comes after sustained adrenaline. And I woke up a little past 10 in the evening to the room dark and my phone showing a string of notifications that I hadn't gotten to yet. I lay in the dark for a moment, coming back to full consciousness slowly and then faster than I wanted to, and the room was quiet. The refrigerator, the road noises, somebody's TV through the ceiling 2 floors up. The normal inventory of a normal apartment at night. And I ran through it the way you do when you're checking that everything is where it should be, which it was, which should have been enough. And then, just at the edge of hearing from somewhere further in the apartment, the bathroom maybe, or the small utility space beyond the kitchen where the water heater was, a sound. Low and wet. It came in a burst of 3 or 4 seconds, and then went quiet and then came again. I lay in the dark and I didn't move, and I listened to it. And the second time that it came, I was more certain about what it was than I wanted to be. And the third time it came, I identified something underneath it. Faint, layered into the main sound, that had a rhythm and a shape that I recognized. I got up, I got the gun off the nightstand, and I turned on the lamp. And I stood in the bedroom doorway looking down the hall at the dark at the end of it. And I stood there for a long time before I did anything else. They sent for me in the dead of winter. It was the season of the long night in Antarctica, when the sun refused to rise and I had no idea what to expect. Even the instructions were vague, almost cryptic, except for one clear detail. I was to report to a research outpost near the pole, isolated in the most desolate place on Earth. As my plane landed, a storm whipped the ice, wind screeching and rattling the metal of the craft. The sky was a bruised shade of purple, and the lights from the base ahead blinked like tiny, pale stars. I felt an oppressive weight settled on my chest the moment that I stepped onto the icy ground. A young soldier, face half hidden under a hood and goggles, approached. He looked relieved to see the priest's collar under my thick wool coat. A good feeling despite me being clearly out of place. "Father Martin?" he asked, his voice muffled by the scarf wrapped around his mouth. I nodded, clutching my bag close, feeling the bite of the wind seep through every layer. "I am, and you are." "Corporal Haynes, sir," he replied, standing stiffly. "They've been waiting for you. You're to come with me to the briefing room immediately." I followed, casting a last look at the endless stretch of ice, only broken by low hills and jagged cliffs in the distance. There was nothing here but emptiness and the howling wind. The silence wasn't like anything that I had ever known, vast and profound, but laced with something unsettling. I pushed the feeling aside as we reached the entrance. Inside the outpost, I was met with metal walls, harsh fluorescent lights, and soldiers in somber green coats. Glancing at me was something that I couldn't quite place. We passed down narrow corridors until Haynes stopped outside a heavy steel door. He knocked and a voice inside called for us to enter. The door creaked open to reveal a man in a crisp uniform, older, with an air of authority that distinctly marked him as someone in command. He stood when I entered, offering a sharp nod. "Father Martin," he said, extending his hand. "Colonel Beckett, thanks for coming." I shook his hand, feeling the firmness of his grip. "I wasn't given many details, Colonel, only that I was needed here for something unusual." He exchanged a look with Haynes, and I caught a flicker of discomfort in his expression. Yes, we apologize for the secrecy. There are certain elements of this mission that we felt best to leave unsaid until you arrived." I raised an eyebrow, feeling the knot in my stomach tighten. "Go on." He hesitated, just for a moment before continuing. "There's a formation nearby, a cave. It's something we found while mapping this area. Strange, enormous, almost like a natural monument. We've had personnel go in and out of it, but it's difficult to explain." Beckett's gaze settled on me, and in his eyes, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. Fear. "I think it's best if you see it for yourself," he said quietly. The drive out was grim. The wind had picked up, tearing against the sides of the vehicle like it was clawing to get in. Outside, snow and ice stretched endlessly, broken only by jagged, leaden rocks protruding like the spine of some long-dead giant buried beneath the white. Corporal Haynes drove in silence, his hands clutched on the wheel. I sat in the back with two soldiers, and neither spoke. They watched the windows, stiff and tense, as if the very land outside might put up a fight against us. Colonel Beckett had given me minimal information before sending us off. "The cave, there's something about it," he had said, staring down at a map on his desk, though I sensed he wasn't really seeing it. "We had a team survey it when we first found it, but they didn't get far before they started acting strangely. One of them even." He broke off, and I had seen a shadow flicker across his face. "How do you mean, acting strangely?" I had pressed, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. He looked up at me, his face set, yet his eyes betrayed something close to dread. "Degradation, paranoia, hallucinations. One man said he felt like he was being watched. Another claimed he could hear voices whispering. They didn't make it far into the cave before I pulled them out. It's as though the place has a presence." He cleared his throat. "I don't put much stock into the supernatural, but my men do. They'll feel better having a priest along." Now, as we drove toward that ominous formation, his words replayed in my mind. Something about it has a presence. The soldiers and I remained silent until finally the vehicle stopped. Haynes killed the engine, and the sudden silence was so intense that it was almost violent. We stepped out into the biting wind, and there, only a few yards away, it stood. A massive stone formation jutted out of the ice, half buried, its shape tenebrous and abrasive against the pale landscape. It had to be about 150 feet tall and 50 feet wide. The entrance itself was a wide black opening, rounded at the edges with jagged rocks outlining it. The snow seemed to pile around the cavern in unnatural drifts, almost as though the cave had disturbed the ice into cracking and shifting at odd and unnatural angles. One of the soldiers, Private Mills, stood beside me, his voice low. "It doesn't look right, does it?" No, I murmured, swallowing. It doesn't. Sergeant Davis, the tallest of the group, tried to break the tension with a forced chuckle. It's just a weird rock formation, he muttered, though his gaze never left the entrance. Nothing more. I glanced at him, studying the tightness around his mouth, the way he clenched his rifle. They all carried their weapons as if they expected something to leap from the depths at any moment. Look, Davis continued, his tone gruff as he glanced at me. I don't know if you really believe in any of this priest stuff, but just stay close, all right? I nodded, offering what I hoped was a reassuring smile. I'll stay close. The men visibly relaxed, but only just. Together, we approached the mouth of the cave, each step crunching under us while the wind muffled out all other sounds. The entrance loomed larger the closer we came, and my skin prickled with this inexplicable sensation of being watched, as if something lay beyond those pitch-shaded pools of emptiness and was observing us from within. Private Mills stopped suddenly, his gaze fixed on the ground near the opening. Look, he whispered, and we followed his gaze. Tracks. Bare footprints in the snow, leading toward the cave mouth and disappearing. The size of the prints suggested they weren't from a grown man, but rather from a child. Who? Corporal Haynes began, his voice barely audible. No one's been out here recently, Sergeant Davis muttered, voice strained. And no one goes barefoot in this weather. They'd be dead in minutes. I felt my hand instinctively reached for the small silver crucifix around my neck. Beckett's words echoed in my mind. There's something about it. A presence. Without another word, we moved forward, stepping into the cavern's gaping mouth. The light behind us faded rapidly, and warm, damp air seemed to seep from the walls, filling the space with an almost suffocating blanket. The beams from our flashlights swept over the cave walls, casting long, shifting shadows that seemed to ripple with the flicker of movement. Inside, the air carrying a faint earthy smell that reminded me of wet metal. Something about it made my skin crawl, though I couldn't place why. Father, Sergeant Davis said, his voice rough but low. He shifted on his feet, eyes avoiding mine. Before we go deeper, maybe you could, say something for luck. The other soldiers nodded, their faces tense and wary in the dim glow. Despite their rifles and years of training, they looked like nervous young boys. I nodded, gathering my words, feeling the chill settle deeper into my skin. I raised a hand, fingers grazing the crucifix that hung from my neck. Almighty God, we place ourselves in your hands as we walk through this place. Shield us and guide us and let your light be our way. Protect these men and keep them steady, and grant us the courage to see this journey through. As I spoke, a low, distant noise echoed through the cavern. It was faint, just a whisper of a sound, but unmistakably unnatural. A slow, grinding roll that rumbled through the walls. It was as if the stone was shifting, growing under some unimaginable force. It lingered in the background, fading in and out like a dull protest. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances, gripping their weapons a little tighter. Mills spoke up, his voice soft. You heard that right? I mean, that wasn't just me. It's probably just the earth is settling, Davis offered, though his voice rattled. These caves are old, should be shifting ice, rocks settling, something like that. Yeah, Corporal Haynes muttered. Just rocks. I lowered my hand, tucking the cross back into my jacket. We'll be all right, I said, though my words sounded hollow even to my own ears. We pressed on, single file, stepping deeper into the cave's dark throat. The walls grew narrower, angling downward in a gradual slope. It felt oddly smooth underfoot, not jagged or broken as one would expect. Instead, it was a continuous winding path, curving gently downward like the inside of some strange winding funnel. The rock itself a shimmer when the flashlight beams caught it, not with any mineral gleam but something damp, as if coated in a thin film of syrupy liquid. Beyond that was a subtle warmth coming from the walls, far warmer than the frozen air outside. "It feels different in here, doesn't it?" Mills muttered, his eyes darting over the tunnel walls. "I mean, shouldn't it still be cold?" Davis scoffed, though his expression remained taut. "Just keep moving, Mills. It's probably a geothermal fissure or something. Heat trapped in the earth." But he too kept looking around, his jaw clenched tight. As we descended further, the path narrowed, forcing us to hunch down as the ceiling dipped lower. The walls seemed to curve inward, and the ground began to slope even steeper. The air grew heavier, thick with a smell that was hard to define, a mix of wet earth and almost something rotten. Every few steps, the faint grinding noise rumbled, a distant echo that hummed in the background like a low grovel. There were no obvious signs of danger, yet a growing unease twisted in my gut. The walls seemed to pulse slightly the longer you stared. I reached out, touching the stone as we passed. It was oddly soft and slick beneath my gloved fingertips. I pulled my hand back, wiping the liquid quickly on my coat, but the sensation lingered. "It feels weird, doesn't it?" Mills whispered, his voice barely audible. "Like we're not supposed to be here." "Keep quiet," Haynes hissed, though his voice was strained. He glanced at me, something pleading in his eyes. "Father, do you feel anything strange here?" I took a breath, steadying myself. "There's something here, but let's just keep our focus," I murmured. They nodded, but I saw their apprehension deepen. We pressed on in silence, each step echoing through the hollow passage, a relentless descent into the unknown. And behind us, the cave walls groaned, as if watching and waiting with a patient yearning. As we pushed down, the silence between us grew heavier in tandem with the walls closing in on us. Ahead, far deeper in the cave, a faint throb pulsed through the air. A slow, steady vibration that seemed to resonate through my head. I couldn't place it, perhaps the sound of gushing water pulsating from somewhere deep within, but that didn't feel right. Do you all feel that?" Mills asked, his voice cracking. He had been quiet for some time, but now his face was pale, eyes darting over his shoulder every few seconds. Sweat glistened on his brow despite the chill that lingered in the tunnel. "Just keep moving," Sergeant Davis barked, though his voice was shallow with his own apprehension. "Nothing's here but rock. Keep your head on straight." But Mills seemed barely to hear him. He stopped, his breathing offbeat, and his gaze went distant, fixed on some invisible point in front of him. I reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder, feeling his muscles tense beneath my grip. "Mills," I said softly, "stay with us." He blinked, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. "I don't think I'm supposed to be here, Father. I feel like something's looking at me. Something that I left behind." His hand trembled as he touched his forehead, muttering to himself. "I don't know how could I have—" "What do you see?" I asked, though my stomach churned, sensing the weight of the horror that he was holding. "It's her," he whispered, voice trembling. "My little girl. She's looking at me, but her face." His hand shot to his mouth, stifling a gasp. His eyes went wide, pupils dilated, as if he were witnessing something unspeakable in the shadows. I could see the fear in him intensify, his gaze wild, darting back and forth as though tracking an unseen presence in the air. She's just standing there, he whispered, his voice cracking. But there's something wrong. Her skin's so pale, like she's been dead for days. Her eyes are, oh God, no. Private, Davis snapped, his voice louder this time. Snap out of it. But Mills only whimpered, his body trembling as if caught with a fever. She's asking me why I left her alone. She's asking why I wasn't there for her when she was sick. Oh, sweetie, I was deployed, I tried, but... His voice faded, eyes wide with panic as he seemed to peer deeper into the shadows. He swayed on his feet, his breathing ragged. And in that moment, I saw something break in him, something primal and terrified. His gaze turned inward, and I felt a pulse of dread shoot through me as he spoke again. She wants me to end it, to end all of it. His voice had taken on an eerie, hollow tone. She says I need to carve her back into me, to feel what she felt, to make up for what I've done. Mills, I gripped his shoulder, but his skin was clammy and unresponsive. His mind trapped to somewhere I couldn't reach. Whatever you're seeing isn't real. You're here with us. Don't let it take you. But he wasn't listening. His hand drifted toward his belt, where a hunting knife gleamed faintly in the dim light. His face twisted a horrible pained grimace, as though he was caught between agony and a sick, twisted desire to give in. She's saying it's the only way. If I just cut deep enough, I can take her place. Maybe then. The throb around us grew louder, pulsing in rhythm with his words. It reverberated through the walls, a sinister vibration that seemed to pulse along with his heartbeat, driving his breast into shallow gasps. I could feel it now, a faint humming beneath my skin, as if something in the depths of the earth was responding, reaching out to him with invisible fingers, pulling him closer to the darkness within himself. Mills, don't, Haynes said, his voice barely above a whisper, fear choking his words. You're not alone, okay? Whatever you're seeing, it's not real. It's the cave that's messing with your head. Don't listen to it. But Mills' expression remained fixed, a horrific blend of grief and resignation, his eyes lost to whatever horrors that he alone could see. His grip tightened on the knife and his gaze shifted between each of us as if we were strangers. Something evil flickered behind his eyes, a darkness taking root, curling its tendrils around him. She wants me to bring you all with me, he said softly, his eyes empty and cold. She says we all deserve it. He raised the knife and I saw the slight tremor in his hand as he aimed it at his own throat, his gaze turning inward again, lost to his private nightmare. Without hesitation, I grabbed Mill's arm, my fingers tightening around his wrist to stop him from lifting the blade any higher. I could feel the violent shudder of his body under my grip, his muscles straining as if caught in some dark trance. His eyes were wild, rimmed with distress and desperation, fixed on some terrible vision beyond my sight. Father, help me, he whispered, but his plea was swallowed by the cavern walls and around us. The pulsing sound only goaded him on. I tightened my grip on Mills, feeling the tremors racking his body as he clutched the knife, poised under his own throat. His eyes were distant and unfocused. He was muttering under his breath, fragments of sentences, each more desperate than the last. Father, please, he rasped, his voice barely his own. She's calling me. She says I need to. No, I interrupted, my voice steady, though I felt the bitterness of woeful inadequacy seeping down into my soul. I drew in a deep breath, reaching for words that I prayed would hold power. God Almighty, Lord of hosts, I began, my voice low but resolute. Banish this darkness from his mind. Cleanse him of this evil. Mills twitched violently as I spoke, his eyes rolling back for a moment before he shuddered, clutching his head. His hand dropped the knife and he began to curl up, his face slick with sweat. But as I continued the prayer, his features softened, the manic light in his eyes dimming, replaced by something fragile, barely holding on. Holy Father, I ask for your light in this place of shadow. I ask for your strength to guide this man, for your mercy to protect him. Shield him from this darkness and hold him close to your grace. Deliver him from evil. The words spilled out of me, fervent and desperate, and I felt the walls themselves recoil from the sound. The pulsing throb that echoed deeper and grew louder, sharper, each beat shuddering through the ground beneath us, almost as if in protest. Mills twitched, his face contorting, his mouth opening and closing as if fighting to speak, but his eyes remained haunted, his lips moving silently as though wrestling with voices that only he could hear. Father, he gasped, his voice thick with fear. It's still here. I can feel it clawing inside me. It's angry, so angry. I gripped his shoulder tighter, refusing to let go. I know, but you're stronger than it. Listen to my voice, not its lies. You are still here with us, with me. Around us, the cave seemed to breathe, a low groan vibrating through the walls as if we had disturbed something that had long slumbered. A faint foul wind stirred, carrying the sharp, acrid scent of sulfur and death. I felt the air tighten, pressing in on us, the very stone resenting my prayer. Do you hear that? Davis softly muttered. He glanced down the passage ahead where the walls grew narrower. His gaze turned distant, his head tilting slightly as if listening to some type of sweet song. Haynes stared transfixed, his own eyes glassy and unfocused. It's beautiful, he murmured. Do you see it, Davis? The light. Davis nodded slowly, a strange smile creeping across his face. Yes, it's calling us. Down there, it's... Wait, I said sharply, but they ignored me, stepping forward in unison, almost as if they were sleepwalking. I kept my hands on Mills, who had begun to shiver violently, his eyes darting toward Davis and Haynes with a growing panic. No, he croaked, his voice hoarse. They can't go down there. Don't let them. Davis, Haynes, I called, but they didn't turn back, didn't even acknowledge me. They walked deeper into the tunnel, following some invisible beacon, their footsteps steady and unwavering. Mills clawed at my hand, his voice frantic. They're walking into it, Father. They're walking right into it. A cold dread filled me as I watched the two soldiers disappear into the shadows, moving with a mechanical calm. I could hear them murmuring to each other, their voices faint. Do you see it? Davis was saying, his voice a strange mixture of awe and reverence. It's so warm. I can feel it, like a heartbeat. Yes, Haynes replied, his tone equally entranced. It's been waiting for us, hasn't it? All this time. Father, please, Mills whispered, his face contorted in cold sweat. Don't let them go any deeper. It's feeding on them, it's pulling them in. I squeezed his shoulder, feeling his pulse racing beneath my hand, erratic and panicked. Hey, stay with me, Mills. Hold on to your faith, your strength. Whatever we're facing, we'll face it together. But as I looked down the darkened tunnel, the faint light from Davis and Haynes' flashlights faded into the depths. Mills gripped my arm, his eyes wild and wide but somehow steady, as if he had found some last flicker of strength within himself. Father, he rasped, pulling me close. You need to go. You have to find them and bring them back. I shook my head, reluctant to leave him behind. Mills, I can't just leave you here. We'll go together. He forced a pained smile. No, you need to go without me. I'll be fine. I can hold my ground here, he said, his gaze distant, a shadow of uncertainty flitting across his face. I'll survive, but they won't if you don't find them. I hesitated, feeling the pulse of trepidation deepen in my stomach, but his grip on my arm was firm, his gaze insistent. He was right. Every second we stayed here, the others drifted further into whatever nightmare lay ahead. I gave him a nod, murmured a quick blessing, and left him curled up in the flickering half-light as I ventured further into the cave. The narrow path had twisted downward, deeper than I thought possible. The walls closed in, damp and pulsing with awful warmth. I quickened my pace, calling out their names, but only my own voice echoed back, swallowed quickly by the oppressive dark. Just as panic began to claw its way into my chest, I caught a flicker of movement ahead, a figure small and pale, stepping out from the shadows. It was a child, barefoot and thin, with snow-white skin and hair that shimmered like gold. He couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, clad in an oversized white shirt. His eyes held a peculiar brightness to them, an unsettling mix of innocence and wisdom that was entirely wrong for someone so young. He looked up at me with a faint smile, a smile that was warm, inviting yet somehow wrong. "Hello, Father," he said softly, his voice lilting, almost musical. "You're looking for your friends, aren't you? But it's too late. They're in the process of leaving us." I felt a cold stab of anxiety pierce my chest. "What do you mean? Where are they?" The child's smile widened, his eyes darkening with something almost playful. "They're lost. They were afraid, Father. They wanted something to cling to, but you left them, just like you left Mills." His words twisted inside me, an accusation that felt like a blade sinking deep. "Mills wanted me to go on," I said, my voice faltering slightly. "But he asked because he knew you wanted to leave him," the child replied, his tone soft and coaxing. "Mills wanted comfort, Father. He wanted someone to stay by his side, to hold him through the fear. You left him alone, and now he's found his way out." I staggered, horror dawning as I understood his meaning. "You're lying. Mills is okay." The child tilted his head, his expression both sympathetic and eerily amused. "You'll see, you left him to die and now he's gone. He's not the first that you've left, is he, Father?" I clenched my jaw, fighting the urge to recoil. The child's words cut deep, touching on wounds that I hadn't known were there, wounds I thought that I had forgotten. "You've sacrificed much, haven't you?" The child continued, his voice gentle now, almost inviting. "A life of loneliness, the vows you took, the vow of chastity, the vow to remain alone in the name of God. No wife, no children. A man who gives everything only to receive nothing in return." His words sank into me, each one twisting with a dark familiarity. I had spent countless nights wrestling with that emptiness, praying for strength, trying to fill a hole I could never speak aloud. "You deserve peace, Father," the child whispered, stepping closer. "You've served enough. God sees your suffering. He wants you to rest. He wants you to be free, to find comfort. If you let go, if you just let go, He'll welcome you with open arms. A martyr, a true saint. He reached for my hand, his touch unnaturally cold. If you end it now, God will still love you. He'll forgive you and you'll never be alone again. My heart pounded, and I felt the weight of his words pressing into me, filling me with a strange, almost seductive numbness. The endless years of service, of sacrifice, of feeling adrift in a world I could only watch from the outside. It all loomed before me, magnified in his gaze. The child smiled, his expression achingly beautiful and sinister, his eyes glowing with that unnatural light. "Take comfort, Father," he murmured. "There's peace waiting, if you'll only reach for it." I stared down at him, my hand trembling in his icy grip. The pulsing throb in the walls seemed to synchronize with my own heartbeat, a steady, relentless rhythm urging me to give in, to find the release that he promised. The urge to surrender, to let go, it tugged at me, tempting me with a potent, honeyed sweetness. My hand still caught in the child's cold grip, it trembled. I felt his promises sinking into me, filling every hollow place, every forgotten ache, each whispered with a gentle cruelty that coaxed me toward surrender. But deep within, something resisted, an ember that refused to extinguish. Slowly, I reached into my pocket and felt that familiar weight of my weapon, my rosary. Closing my eyes, I took a steadying breath. I clutched the first bead between my fingers and began to pray, my voice a murmur beneath the oppressive presence. "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee." The child's face darkened, his smile faltering as he watched me. "Father," he said, his voice soft, a trace of warning in his tone. "You're clinging to something that can't help you. Those words, they're meaningless." "Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus." A faint twitch flickered in his expression, and his grip on my hand tightened painfully. "You don't have to do that, Father," he hissed, his voice softening to a venomous murmur. "You're wasting your time. God won't hear you here, and she doesn't care. Pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death." The boy's face began to twist, his soft features stretching and contorting, his skin paling to a deathly yellow. His eyes grew darker, almost cavernous, swallowing any semblance of humanity. Its childlike limbs elongated, thin and bony, with its small hands growing into long and claw-like fingers. The thing's mouth twisted into an obscene grin, revealing sharp, uneven teeth that glistened wetly in the dim light. I stumbled back, clutching the rosary to my chest as the creature stood before me, now a hideous, twisted apparition of what he had once appeared to be. "You think you can resist me?" The voice that came from his mouth was no longer that of a child. It was a guttural, grating growl, resonating with a power that shook the very air. The walls seemed to tremble, responding to his words as if they too were a part of him, a living, breathing extension of his will. "You're standing in my flesh, priest," he sneered, gesturing to the walls around us. "You walk through my veins, feel my breath in the stones, hear my pulse in the dark. This is my body, and you are nothing but a morsel within it." The walls seemed to close in around me, their surfaces undulating subtly, taking on a sickening, organic quality. The faint pulsing sound echoed louder, its rhythm a slow, hungry beat. "You and your friends will never leave," he continued, his voice dripping with malice. "I will consume every one of you, swallow you whole and bury you in the depths of my being." Its form rippled, growing larger, filling the cavern with its grotesque presence. Shadows writhed around it like tendrils, reaching toward me with claws that seemed to scrape the very air. I felt an intense, crushing weight pressing down on my body. But then, with a single sneer, it vanished, dissipating like smoke into the void. Silence fell thick and heavy. I took a shaky breath, clutching my rosary, forcing myself to focus, to stay grounded. Just as my mind settled, I saw them. Davis and Haynes standing at the edge of a narrow drop deeper in the tunnel. Their backs to me, their faces turned downward. They were muttering to themselves, their voices low, strained as though speaking to something just below them. "Davis!" I called out, stepping toward them, my voice echoing in the silence. He didn't respond. His eyes were vacant, unfocused, staring into the pit below. In one hand he held his rifle, the barrel tilted toward his jaw, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. Haynes stood beside him, clutching a knife, the blade pressed to his wrist, his hand trembling. I felt a cold wave of horror wash over me as I realized what they were about to do. "No, don't!" I cried, rushing forward, but they seemed oblivious to my presence. Their faces twisted in silent agony, their expressions lost to some invisible torment. "Mother," Davis whispered, his voice cracking, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to, I didn't want to. I can't live with it anymore." Haynes' voice, soft, distant, echoed his pain. "I'll see you soon, Sam. I'll make it right. I'll make it right." "Stop!" I shouted, my voice desperate, my hands reaching for them. "You don't have to do this. Whatever you're seeing, it isn't real. This place is lying to you." They faltered just for a moment, but the darkness around them seemed to throb in time with their despair, pulling them back and feeding on their guilt, their pain. "Davis, Haynes," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "Listen to me, you are not alone. Whatever you're seeing, whatever you're hearing, it's a lie. I'm here, we're in this together." For a brief, fragile moment, they seemed to hesitate, their hands loosening, their weapons lowering. But the shadows deepened, as though the cave itself was watching, waiting, hungry for their surrender. Before I could stop him, Davis squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report echoed deafeningly through the cave, reverberating off the walls in a single, heart-wrenching note that seemed to shudder through my entire body. I watched helpless as he crumpled forward, his body folding onto the cold stone, his eyes glassy and distant, his lips parted in an expression of intense grief. The darkness around him seemed to twist with satisfaction, engorging as if absorbing his very essence. Then, as his body relaxed, he tumbled downward. "Davis," I whispered, but he was already gone. Haynes, now standing alone, trembling and dazed, pressed the blade against his wrist. He sliced through. Red flowed immediately, pooling in dark rivulets against the stone. His face paled, his eyes wide and unfocused. He swayed, barely able to keep upright. "No!" I cried, rushing to his side, grabbing his wrist to stop the bleeding. My fingers slipped in the warm, slick blood, and I fought to keep a hold on him as he gasped, his gaze swimming with a mixture of horror and confusion. "Haynes, stay with me!" I urged, tearing open the emergency kit strapped to his vest. I pulled out the tourniquet, quickly wrapping it around his arm and tightening it until the bleeding slowed. "This place is lying to you, feeding on your fears. Don't let it win. Don't leave us." Haynes blinked, his face contorting in pain as he seemed to come back to himself. His breathing slowed and his eyes met mine, clear but twitchy. "Father," he whispered, voice shaking. "I saw my brother. He was calling me." "It's not real," I said, steadying him with one hand on his shoulder. Whatever you're seeing, whatever you're feeling, it's this place trying to break you. Keep your focus, we're getting out of here together. I began to recite a prayer under my breath as I clutched my rosary in one hand, anchoring myself in Haynes and the only protection that I knew. As I spoke, Haynes' breathing steadied further, his gaze sharpened, and I could see the light of awareness return to his eyes. He nodded weakly, gripping my hand as if holding onto a lifeline. Thank you, Father," he whispered, his voice broken. Just then, a familiar voice echoed through the chamber, joining my prayer. I looked up stunned to see Mills stepping out of the darkness, his face lit with a fierce, defiant faith that seemed to pierce the shadows around us. He was muttering prayers of his own, his lips moving in a steady, relentless rhythm, as though each word was a weapon against the dark. His eyes bright with determination. "She told me to come here, Father." With Haynes leaning heavily on my shoulder and Mills at my side, we turned and began to make our way back up the twisted path that we had come from. Every step felt like a battle, the cave itself seeming to shift, the walls narrowing and closing in. Dark tendrils of rock and earth creeped inward, scraping against our arms and shoulders, pushing us back with an almost living hostility. "Move faster," Mills urged, grabbing my arm and pulling me forward as the tunnel seemed to twist and distort, bending strangely. Haynes groaned, his face pale from blood loss, but he kept moving, leaning on both Mills and me. I could feel his strength fading, yet his steps remained steady. A deep growl rose from the earth, reverberating through the cave like a predator's roar, and the ground beneath us buckled, sending cracks spidering out along the path. The walls writhed, forming ghastly shapes, hands reaching out, mouths gaping open, eyes staring with unseen malice. "Keep praying," Haynes murmured, his voice shaking. "It hates that." With a surge of courage, I raised my voice, shouting the prayers that I had once whispered, my voice echoing through the passageway, defying the cave's relentless grip. Mills joined me, his voice strong and unwavering, and Haynes, though weak, whispered along, clinging to the words. "Deliver us, Lord, from every evil," I chanted, my heart pounding as we pushed forward, each step a desperate race against the cavern's grasp. The tunnel seemed to lengthen, stretching out as if mocking our escape, but we pressed on, refusing to surrender to the hungry beast that surrounded us. The walls screamed in rage, a high-pitched keening sound that set my teeth on edge. But I held tight to my rosary, feeling the warmth of my faith steady me, guiding our way through the twisting, winding path. At last, a sliver of light appeared ahead, faint but unmistakable. The cold, pure light of the outside world spilled into the tunnel, piercing the darkness. Summoning our final reserves of strength, we stumbled toward it, each step tearing us from the cavern's grip, until with one final lurch, we staggered into the biting Antarctic air. I could feel Haynes sag against my shoulder, Mills steadying him from the other side as we struggled to put distance between ourselves and that hellish place. The men were exhausted, their faces pale, their breaths shallow, but we were out. We had made it. Behind us, the entrance to the cave began to shudder, the walls buckling inward as if drawn by some invisible force. The shadows within twisted and writhed, giving one last violent tremor before the entire cavern collapsed inward. Rock folding over itself with the closing of a monstrous jaw. The ground heaved and shuddered. A deep resonant roar shot through the ice and snow as the cavern swallowed itself, disappearing into the earth. "Move," I shouted, urging Mills and Haynes further back as the earth beneath us bucked and lurched, the very land shifting under our feet. We scrambled up a ridge, the snow clinging to our boots, the biting cold tearing into us. We barely made it to the top of the ridge when a powerful quake rippled through the ground, an immense tremor that nearly knocked us off our feet. Below, the ground where the cave had been began to sink. Snow and rock fell into the abyss as if dragged by some unspeakable hand. I watched, awestruck and horrified, as the earth closed in over the spot, leaving nothing but an empty patch of snow and jagged rock. The throbbing hum that had haunted us faded, replaced by the full silence of the frozen wasteland. Mills held his head, his face pale. God, it's like it was never there. Haynes, his arm still bound tightly by the tourniquet, gave a slow, shaky nod. Just gone. We stood there, shivering in the cold, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. The cave, the presence with it, it was all buried, hidden beneath the ice, as if nature itself had decided to seal away that unspeakable terror. After a long, silent moment, I placed a hand on Haynes' shoulder and nodded toward the distant lights of the base camp. "Come on," I said quietly. "Let's get you some medical attention." The trek back to the base was a somber one. None of us spoke, each of us lost in our own thoughts, our own memories of what had transpired. I led the way, clinging to the faint light of my fate, feeling its warmth steady me against the bitter wind that clawed at us, the chill more biting than ever. When we finally reached the base, Colonel Beckett was waiting for us, his face unreadable. He studied each of us in silence, his gaze lingering on Haynes' blood-soaked arm and the distant look in Mill's eyes. Without a word, he gestured for medics to take the two men, and I watched as they led Haynes and Mills away, their expressions weary. The Colonel and I were left standing alone in the freezing night, his gaze sharp and searching as he turned to me. "Well?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "What happened down there?" I took a deep breath, struggling to find the right words. How could I describe what we had seen, what we had felt? How could I explain the cave that had nearly swallowed us, the unholy presence that had lingered inside? I hesitated, finally meeting his gaze. "It was something evil, Colonel, something beyond our understanding. I don't know what you expected us to find, but whatever that was, it's better left buried." The Colonel's jaw tightened, but he nodded slowly, his eyes unreadable. "And the sergeant?" "Davis didn't make it," I said quietly, feeling the weight of those words settle heavily on my shoulders. "But Mills and Haynes?" I paused, glancing back toward the med bay where they were being treated. "Oh, they'll recover, physically at least." He nodded again, his expression softening just a fracture. "I'm sorry, Father, this wasn't... I didn't know that it would turn out like this." "Neither did I replied, clasping my hands, my fingers brushing the rosary that still hung around my fingers. "But it's over now. Whatever was in that place, it's gone." The Colonel watched me for a moment, his eyes filled with the weight of questions that he had never asked. He didn't believe in the supernatural, but even he could sense that we had faced something else. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice softer than I had ever heard it. As I prepared to leave Antarctica, I felt an odd sense of peace mixed with sorrow. The darkness in that cave had nearly claimed us, but we had survived. And as I boarded the plane, I whispered one last prayer.